They moved with efficient, brutal precision that spoke of years of practice and unlimited resources. Men in dark tactical gear emblazoned with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, flooded her apartment like a coordinated invasion force. They carried electronic jammers that immediately killed her internet connection and cell phone signal, ensuring that no evidence of the raid could be transmitted to the outside world. Mara didn't resist. She couldn't. The revelation of her own name in the exercise documents had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She sat frozen in her chair as they systematically dismantled her entire investigation, bagging computers, hard drives, printed documents, and the original VHS tape that had started everything. Mara Ellison, the team leader announced, his voice carrying the flat, bureaucratic authority of someone who had recited these words many times before. You are being detained under the Espionage Act and the provisions of the Patriot Act for the unauthorized access of classified material and conspiracy to aid terrorist entities in their ongoing operations against the United States. The charges were absurd, but Mara understood that absurdity was the point. In the post-9/11 legal framework, the government's definition of terrorism had expanded to include almost any activity that challenged official narratives. Her research, her questions, her very curiosity had been redefined as acts of treason. As they led her out in handcuffs, past the terrified faces of neighbours who would remember her as the woman who had turned out to be a spy, Mara caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. It was Kellerman, the man from the cafe, observing her arrest with the detached professionalism of someone monitoring a completed operation. Their eyes met for a brief moment and he nodded slightly, not in greeting or sympathy, but in acknowledgement, a confirmation that everything had proceeded according to plan. The government's case against her was presented in a sealed FISA court, where neither the evidence nor the proceedings were accessible to public scrutiny. They had documentation of her accessing classified servers, recordings of her encrypted communications with foreign assets like at Radar Ghost, and her own research notes that they characterized as intelligence gathering for hostile entities. They presented her investigation not as the work of a concerned citizen or independent researcher, but as a sophisticated espionage operation designed to undermine public confidence in government institutions and aid terrorist recruitment. Every question she had asked was reframed as an attack on national security. Every fact she had uncovered was presented as intelligence that could be used against American interests. The judge, operating under national security guidelines that prioritize state secrets over due process, sentenced her to indefinite detention in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility designed to make dangerous criminals disappear from the world. She was classified as a Level 6 terrorist, a designation that eliminated most constitutional protections and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following her arrest. Fragments of her research began appearing online, leaked to conspiracy theory websites and alternative media platforms in carefully edited chunks. Anonymous accounts uploaded her audio analysis comparing the ATC recordings, her financial charts tracking the put options, and scanned pages from Dr. Thorne's suppressed paper. The leaks were incomplete and disconnected, presenting tantalizing glimpses of a larger truth without providing the comprehensive narrative that Mara had spent months constructing. Each fragment raised more questions than it answered, creating a puzzle that thousands of amateur researchers began trying to solve. The story spread through the conspiracy theory ecosystem with viral intensity. Mara Ellison became a martyred truth-teller, a patriotic whistleblower who had been silenced by a tyrannical government for asking inconvenient questions. Her name appeared on protest signs and bumper stickers. Her fragmented research became the foundational text of a new generation of 9/11 truth-seekers who built elaborate theories around the gaps in her evidence. Online forums dedicated to her case attracted hundreds of thousands of members who spent countless hours analysing every leaked document, enhancing every audio file, and connecting dots that may or may not have been related. The movement consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from people who might otherwise have been investigating more immediate and actionable forms of government corruption. In her solitary cell, staring at concrete walls that never varied, Mara had years to think about what had really happened to her. She had access to limited reading materials, carefully selected books and magazines that were screened for security risks, but no internet, no phone calls, and no contact with the outside world except for monthly visits from a government-appointed psychiatrist who documented her mental state for official records. During those long, empty hours, she began to understand the true sophistication of the operation she had been part of. The evidence she had uncovered was real. The financial anomalies, the radar substitutions, the media manipulation had all been genuine. But her discovery of them hadn't been accidental. She had been led to each revelation by a carefully constructed trail that had made her feel like an independent investigator while actually being a participant in a psychological experiment. The goal wasn't to suppress inconvenient truths about September 11th. It was to manage them, to ensure that people who asked dangerous questions were given satisfying, but ultimately harmless answers that would occupy their attention without threatening the real power structures that had profited from the attacks. Her research had been allowed to develop just far enough to create compelling conspiracy theories, but not far enough to identify the specific individuals and institutions that were actually responsible. She had mapped the edges of the conspiracy while being carefully steered away from its centre. The 9/11 truth movement that had grown around her, leaked research was exactly what the system needed. A large, vocal, but ultimately marginalised group that absorbed dissent and channeled it into harmless activities like conference presentations, documentary films and internet discussions. The conspiracy theorists served as controlled opposition, providing an outlet for skepticism while ensuring that genuine investigation was drowned in a sea of speculation and theory. But perhaps most insidiously, her case had established a precedent for the treatment of future researchers. Anyone who began asking serious questions about government actions would be confronted with the example of Mara Ellison, the translator who had thought she was uncovering truth, but had actually been playing a role in an elaborate deception, and who had ended up spending her life in prison for crimes she didn't understand she was committing. The message was clear. The cost of curiosity was too high, the risk of investigation was too great, and the line between research and treason was too thin for ordinary citizens to navigate safely. Years passed in the unchanging routine of maximum security imprisonment. Mara aged in her cell, her dark hair going grey, her body adapting to the constraints of a space designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term solitary confinement, a psychological adjustment to environmental deprivation that allowed consciousness to survive even when hope had been systematically eliminated. But her mind remained sharp and she continued to think about the implications of her experience. If her investigation had been managed from the beginning, if her discoveries had been strategically placed for her to find, then how many other conspiracy theories were actually psychological operations designed to misdirect public attention? How many whistleblowers had been selected and groomed for their role? How many leaked documents were authentic information released in carefully controlled ways to create the illusion of transparency while actually deepening the confusion? How many truth seekers were unwittingly serving the interests of the very systems they believed they were opposing? The questions haunted her, but they also provided a strange form of comfort. Even in prison, even stripped of freedom and identity, she was still thinking, still analysing, still trying to understand the shape of the cage that had been built around human consciousness. In her 10th year of imprisonment, Mara received an unexpected visitor. The guard who escorted her to the visitation room was apologetic. Visits were rare, and this one hadn't been scheduled through normal channels. The visitor was a young woman, perhaps 25, with the intense focus and slightly manic energy that Mara recognised in herself from decades earlier. "Ms. Ellison," the woman said, speaking quickly as if afraid their time would be cut short. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been researching your case for the past 3 years, and I think I've found something important. Something about Building 7 that nobody has ever..." Mara held up her hand, stopping the young woman mid-sentence. Through the reinforced glass that separated them, she looked into Rebecca's eager, determined face, and saw herself at the beginning of a journey that could only end in this same room on the other side of the same glass. "Ms. Torres," Mara said quietly, her voice rough from years of disuse, "let me ask you something. How did you first learn about my case? What was the first piece of evidence that made you think there was a story worth investigating?" Rebecca's enthusiasm was undimmed. "It was a video file that was posted anonymously to a secure drop site, footage of Building 7 that I'd never seen before, with audio that hadn't been available in any of the official archives. The timing discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for." Mara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Another tape, another anomaly, another researcher being led down a carefully prepared path that would feel like discovery, while actually being manipulation. "Ms. Torres," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young filmmaker, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to walk out of here, delete whatever research you've done, and never think about any of this again." But even as she spoke, Mara knew it was hopeless. Rebecca Torres had the same look in her eyes that Mara had once seen in her own mirror, the absolute certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The same conviction that had led Mara to spend 20 years in a cage built from her own curiosity. The cycle would continue. New researchers would be recruited, new evidence would be strategically placed, new truth seekers would be transformed into unwitting participants in their own imprisonment. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened on September 11th. It was about what happened to anyone who tried to look too closely at power, who asked too many questions, who believed that truth was something that could be found rather than something that was manufactured. As the guard led her back to her cell, Mara realised that she had finally understood the true scope of the operation she'd been part of. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide a single crime. It was a system for managing reality itself, for ensuring that the truth would always be whatever those in power needed it to be. The smoke behind the towers wasn't just the debris of a single day's deception. It was the fog of war in a conflict that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war against the very possibility of independent thought, waged with weapons of information and cages built from curiosity itself. And in that war, every truth seeker was both a casualty and a weapon, both a victim and an unwitting soldier in an army that was fighting against its own cause. The tape that shouldn't exist had led her exactly where it was supposed to lead her, into a truth that was indistinguishable from a lie, a cage that was built from the very evidence that had seemed to promise freedom. In the end, Mara Ellison had found exactly what she was looking for, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The smoke behind the towers, an extended investigation. What if the single most defining event of the 21st century wasn't what we were told? We've all seen the footage, heard the official story, and lived with the consequences. But what happens when a single piece of evidence lost in the system for over 2 decades falls into the hands of the one person with the skills and obsession to see the cracks in the narrative? This is not a story about easy answers. It's a story about the questions that can unravel a reality. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Sleep Theories and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the world's greatest mysteries, and what you're about to read will have you questioning everything. In the comments below, let us know. After learning about the inconsistencies, what's the one piece of the 9/11 puzzle that never sat right with you? Now settle in. This is the smoke behind the towers. The dust in Mara Ellison's apartment was a library of dead projects. It settled on the spines of German legal dictionaries, coated the cooling fins of her overworked computer, and formed a fine grey film on the stacked plastic boxes of government transcripts that were her livelihood. The apartment itself was a testament to organised chaos. Cables snaking between translation equipment, multiple keyboards in different alphabets, and towers of reference materials that threatened to topple with each vibration from the subway below. Mara was a freelance translator, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, hired for her fluency in 5 languages and her singular, obsessive attention to detail. She didn't just translate words, she translated context, subtext, and the terrifying silence between official lines. Her clients range from immigration lawyers needing farcy depositions, translated to federal agencies requiring real-time interpretation of intercepted communications. It was solitary work that suited her temperament. She'd always been more comfortable with the precision of language than the chaos of human interaction. The package from the Department of Defence's Archival Division was standard. A reinforced cardboard box, a chain of custody form clipped to the top, and inside 12 VHS tapes labelled with alphanumeric codes denoting a declassified batch of field communications from the early 2000s. The accompanying documentation was sparse. A single-page memo requesting translation of any foreign language chatter captured in the background. The pay was modest but steady, and Mara had developed a reputation for catching linguistic details that others missed. Her workspace was a shrine to analogue precision. The professional-grade VCR, a Sony model worth more than most people's cars, sat connected to a digital audio interface that allowed her to isolate frequency ranges and enhance muffled conversations. Multiple monitors displayed waveform analysis software alongside translation databases. She worked methodically, her headphones sealing her in a world of static, fragmented Farsi, Arabic phrases, and the ambient hum of old magnetic tape. The first 11 tapes were unremarkable: routine military communications, helicopter pilots discussing weather conditions, occasional snippets of foreign languages that were either too corrupted to translate or turned out to be harmless civilian chatter picked up by sensitive equipment. She documented everything with academic precision, noting timestamps, speaker identifications, and confidence levels for her translations. Tape 7 was different from the moment she picked it up. Its label, DOD-AFC-0, 91101-BROLL-4, was slightly smudged, the ink appearing fresher than the others despite the identical date stamps. The B-roll designation caught her attention, typically used for supplementary footage, background material that never made it to air. September 11th, 2001, was faded but legible in the corner, written in what looked like different handwriting than the official labels. She slotted it into the VCR with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, and pressed play. The screen fizzed to life with the chaotic, familiar horror of that morning. But this wasn't the sanitized, repeatedly broadcast footage that had been burned into collective memory. This was raw, unprocessed, shot from what appeared to be a news helicopter hovering at an angle she'd never seen before. The North Tower bled a furious black plume into a perfect blue sky, but the colours were wrong. They were too vivid, too saturated, as if the horror had been amplified by the unfiltered lens. Her trained eye, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in testimony and documentation, caught it immediately. In the lower third of the frame, a time code burned into the tape read 08:42:17 Eastern Standard Time. She knew the official timeline by heart. American Airlines. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m, a 4-minute discrepancy. A chill, small and precise, traced a path down her spine. Technical errors were common in archival footage, she rationalised. Equipment malfunctions, camera operators forgetting to sync their timestamps. She'd seen it hundreds of times in legal depositions where security cameras showed impossible timelines. But as she continued watching, the discrepancy held. The timecode advanced in perfect synchronization with real time, never jumping or resetting. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was consistent, deliberate, accurate. And if it was accurate, then everything she knew about that morning was built on a foundation of sand. Then she heard the voices. They were not the panicked cries of civilians or the frantic dispatches of news anchors that had filled the airwaves. These voices were cool, professional, crackling with the distinct compression of military-grade communication systems. They were barely audible under the rotor wash and wind noise, but her equipment could isolate and enhance them. "Command, this is Skywatch. Confirmed scenario is live. Repeat, is this Vigilant Guardian live or real world?" The voice was young, male, with the clipped precision of military training but an undertone of confusion that made Mara's pulse quicken. A pause, filled with the sound of roaring fire and distant sirens. When the response came, it was from a different voice, older, calmer, carrying the authority of rank. "Maintain exercise protocol. All units, This is a live fly exercise. Treat all tracks as simulated until otherwise notified. The first voice came back, strain creeping in. Skywatch copies. Maintaining protocol. Jesus, that's a lot of smoke for a simulation. Another voice joined the channel, different again, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. Command. Falcon 2 requesting permission to vector intercept on the southern track. We show multiple bogies, but exercise parameters did not account for this density. Negative Falcon 2. Maintain exercise posture. All tracks are part of the scenario until command confirms otherwise. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Vigilant Guardian. The name meant nothing to her, but the context was unmistakable. They were talking about an exercise, a drill, at the exact moment when the real attack was unfolding. The confusion in their voices was genuine. They couldn't tell what was real and what was simulation. She rewound the tape, listening again with professional focus. The voices were too clear to be atmospheric noise, too organised to be random civilian communications. This was operational military chatter, recorded at the highest levels of the response hierarchy. And according to the time code, it was happening before the official narrative said the first plane had even hit. The camera panned, and she saw the South Tower in the background, pristine and untouched. According to every official record, every news report, every commission finding, the South Tower would remain undamaged for another 17 minutes. But these military voices were already talking about multiple targets, exercise protocols, and maintaining simulation status. The official story was a solid wall, a monument of accepted fact constructed from thousands of testimonies, investigations and reports. But this tape was a hairline fracture in the granite. It was a glimpse of the scaffolding behind the monument, the framework that held up the official truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rational part of her mind insisted this was a mislabeled tape, a bureaucratic error. Her contract was explicit about mishandled materials. They were to be reported immediately, returned to the appropriate authorities for proper classification review. But curiosity, that quiet, relentless engine that had driven her through graduate school and into a career built on uncovering meaning in chaos, overrode the fear. She didn't eject the tape. Instead, she connected it to her digital capture system and began making a perfect copy, frame by frame, preserving every pixel and every audio sample. The chill in her spine had become a frozen river, carrying with it the terrible realization that she was holding something that could unravel everything. This tape shouldn't exist, and she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime connecting dots that others refused to see, that she could never unsee what was on it. As the tape played on, she began taking meticulous notes, documenting call signs, voice patterns, and radio procedures. The military communications continued throughout the footage, painting a picture of an operation that was simultaneously a drill and a real-world crisis, a Schrödinger's catastrophe where reality and simulation existed in quantum superposition, until someone with the authority to collapse the wave function decided what was real. That someone, she was beginning to suspect, was not who the world thought it was. Sleep didn't come. The images played on the backs of her eyelids in an endless loop. The impossibly blue sky, the black smoke billowing against it, the time code burning like a digital scar across her vision. The voices echoed in her memory, their professional calm masking confusion that ran deeper than anyone had ever admitted publicly. By 5 a.m, she was at her desk, the glow of her monitors the only light in the pre-dawn gloom of her apartment. The city outside was beginning its daily resurrection, but Mara existed in a different timeline now, one where the morning of September 11th, 2001 was not history, but an active investigation. Her first stop was the public archive of the 9/11 Commission, a digital tomb containing thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits, and evidence. She had accessed these files before for various translation projects, but now she approached them with the focus of a detective rather than a linguist. The official transcripts were sanitized, edited for clarity and context, with extensive redactions that created black holes in the narrative where sensitive information had been surgically removed. but buried deep in a subsidiary server, linked through footnotes and cross-references that most casual researchers would never follow, she found the motherlode. Raw audio files from air traffic control centers. These were the unedited feeds from Boston Center, New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, and Cleveland Center, the front lines of confusion that morning. She put on her professional headphones, the world fading away as she prepared to immerse herself in the chaos. The audio quality was poor, compressed through multiple digital transfers over 2 decades, but her equipment could clean it up. She opened her spectrum analysis software and began the painstaking process of isolating individual voices from the cacophony. The first recordings were exactly what she expected. Controllers struggling to understand what was happening to American Airlines Flight 11. The standard protocols were breaking down in real time as they tried to re-establish contact with a plane that was no longer responding to their calls. American 11, Boston Center, are you there? The controller's voice was professional but edged with the first hints of concern. Static filled the channel. American 11, Boston Center, please respond. More urgent now, the procedural calm beginning to crack. Then a new voice entered the channel, higher pitched, laced with confusion. Boston Center, this is New York approach. We're showing a primary target, fast mover, not squawking transponder. Is this part of the Nordo drill? Nordo, no radio communications. Mara's blood turned to ice water. The Boston controller's response was immediate and sharp. What drill? I don't have anything about a drill on the roster today. What's your location on that primary? Another voice cut in. Different frequency, probably a pilot monitoring emergency channels. Center, this is Delta 243 Heavy. We're hearing some strange chatter on guard frequency. Are we exercising today? Our dispatcher didn't mention anything. Delta 243, stand by. We're trying to sort out some communication issues with one of our aircraft. But the pilot pressed. Center, serious question. We're showing traffic on our TCAS that doesn't correlate with what you're calling out. Our system is painting targets where you're not showing anything. Is this part of some kind of exercise? The timestamp on this exchange was 8:43 a.m., 3 minutes before the official time of impact. The confusion wasn't happening after the attack. It was the environment in which the attack was unfolding. The system was already compromised, already uncertain about what was real and what was simulation. Mara spent the next 16 hours obsessively comparing this raw audio to the sanitized news footage from that morning, using professional editing software to align timelines with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She created a split-screen comparison, audio waveforms on one side, video timestamps on the other, and she found them, the edits. In the raw ATC tape, a controller could be heard screaming, "He's descending fast, passing 9,000 rate of descent. Jesus Christ, what the hell is he?" The audio cut out completely for exactly 0.2 of a second. A perfect digital slice that could only have been made in post-production. When it resumed, a different controller was speaking in measured professional tones. "We have an aircraft emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency descent." The panic had been surgically removed, replaced with standard phraseology that suggested control rather than chaos. She found 17 such edits in the first hour of ATC audio alone. Each one removed confusion, uncertainty, or references to exercises and drills. The real-time breakdown of the air traffic control system had been edited into a narrative of professionals responding to an unprecedented but comprehensible crisis. But the video footage revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. She had obtained raw news helicopter footage from multiple sources, some from official archives, others from amateur collectors who had recorded the live broadcasts. Frame-stepping through a raw feed uploaded by a news photographer years later, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The famous shot of the second impact, broadcast live to millions, showed the plane entering the frame and striking the South Tower in one continuous motion. But in the unedited raw footage, there was a discontinuity. 3 frames before the impact, the camera jerked violently downward, as if the operator had been startled or knocked off balance, showing the streets below for exactly 1/8 of a second before cutting back to the tower, just in time to capture the fireball. It was a blink and you miss it edit, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The live broadcast had been edited in real time, with a buffer delay that allowed editors to remove the moment of human shock and replace it with a perfect, unobstructed view of the impact. The audience of one in her dusty apartment was now facing a terrifying possibility. The news wasn't just reporting the event, it was curating it in real time, managing the narrative as it unfolded, ensuring that the world saw exactly what someone wanted them to see. The difference between what happened and what was broadcast might be measured in fractions of seconds, but those fractions contained entire universes of meaning. She pulled up the official timeline, cross-referencing it with her growing database of anomalies. The pattern was clear. Every moment of confusion, every instance where the official response system revealed its underlying chaos, had been carefully edited out of the historical record. What remained was a streamlined narrative of surprise, response and tragedy, clean enough to build policy on, coherent enough to justify the reshaping of an entire civilization. But the real story was in the gaps, in the deleted seconds where the facade slipped and revealed the machinery underneath. The tape she had found wasn't just evidence of poor timekeeping or sloppy journalism. It was proof that someone had been editing history in real time, sculpting reality as it unfolded, ensuring that the official story would be the only story that survived. The question that now consumed her was simple and terrible. If they were editing the news as it happened, what else were they controlling? The digital rabbit hole led her inevitably to the physical world. Knowledge had a weight, she realised, and after 3 days of staring at screens, she needed to feel the heft of actual books, the texture of paper that had existed before the internet had made all information suspect. The New York Public Library's Science, Industry and Business Library was a temple to pre-digital knowledge, its research floors filled with bound periodicals and technical journals that predated the homogenization of online information. She took the subway through the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of every face, every reflection in the train windows, the paranoia now a constant background hum in her consciousness. She requested archived journals from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineering International, and the Journal of Constructional Steel Research, focusing on publications from late 2001 through 2003. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to exist in permanent twilight, led her to a research carrel buried deep in the stacks. The official reports were unequivocal and had been cited thousands of times. The intense jet fuel fires had softened the steel structural members, causing thermal expansion that pushed the floor joists off their supports. The floors pancaked down onto each other in a progressive collapse that accelerated due to the increasing mass and momentum. It was tragic but straightforward physics. Fire weakens steel, gravity does the rest. But in the months immediately following the attacks, before the official narrative had crystallized and academic careers had been threatened, a different conversation was happening in the margins of professional literature. She found letters to the editor, brief technical notes, and transcripts from early conferences where structural engineers voiced quiet, professional skepticism. One article, published in a now-defunct journal called Structural Integrity Review, bore the innocuous title Anomalies in the WTC Collapse Dynamics, a Preliminary Analysis. The author was Dr. Aris Thorne, a professor of structural engineering at Northwestern University with 40 years of experience in high-rise design and failure analysis. Dr. Thorne's analysis was methodical and damning. Using basic principles of physics and publicly available measurements, he demonstrated that the towers had fallen through the path of greatest resistance, the undamaged lower floors and the intact core columns at virtually freefall speed. For that to happen, he argued, the structural resistance had to have been removed almost entirely and almost simultaneously. The observed collapse is consistent with the near instantaneous failure of critical load-bearing elements across multiple floors, he wrote. This failure mode is not consistent with thermal effects from hydrocarbon fires, which would create non-uniform heating and progressive failure. It is, however, consistent with controlled demolition techniques designed to minimize structural resistance during collapse. He included mathematical models showing that even if the fires had weakened the steel by 50%, far more than the official reports claimed, the remaining structure should have provided significant resistance to collapse. The floors should have fallen irregularly, the core columns should have remained standing, and the overall collapse time should have been significantly longer. It is akin to a car falling through the bottom of a multi-storey parking garage, he wrote, with each floor providing progressively less resistance, despite having suffered no structural damage. The physics simply do not support the official explanation. The article was peer-reviewed and published in March 2002. 3 months later, Dr. Thorne's research funding was terminated. By the end of the year, the journal itself had ceased publication, its parent organisation citing financial difficulties and changing market conditions. But Mara's investigation revealed a more complex story. Cross-referencing the journal's subscription database with the author affiliations in Dr. Thorne's article, she discovered that 7 of the 12 peer reviewers who had approved the paper were subsequently denied tenure, transferred to non-research positions, or had their federal funding mysteriously disappear. The systematic dismantling of the academic infrastructure that had supported the questioning of the official narrative was surgical in its precision. Dr. Thorne himself became her new obsession. His university profile, archived on the Internet Wayback Machine, showed a distinguished career spanning 4 decades, with over 200 published papers and millions of dollars in research grants. But in early 2002, his page was updated to show that he had taken an indefinite sabbatical for personal reasons. She dug deeper, following a trail through archived academic mailing lists, conference proceedings, and professional networking sites. The last traces of Dr. Thorne's professional existence were found in a niche engineering message board devoted to structural failure analysis. The forum had been active from 1997 to 2003, when it was apparently taken offline permanently. But Mara had learned to look in the forgotten corners of the internet, the places where data went to die but never quite disappeared. Using advanced search techniques and cached page reconstructions, she found fragments of the discussion threads. Dr. Thorne's final posts were increasingly frantic in tone. He described pressure from university administrators, threats to his family's safety, and mysterious visitors who claimed to be federal investigators but carried no proper identification. His last post, dated September 15, 2002, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the attacks, was brief and chilling. The data is the data. Mathematical models don't lie. Steel doesn't care about politics, and gravity is not a government agency. They can threaten my funding, my reputation, even my family. But they can't change the laws of physics. I've said all I can. To those still listening, they're watching. I suggest you all be careful what you look for. You might not like what finds you back. He never posted again. A follow-up news search revealed a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, buried on page 7 of the Metro section 6 months later. University professor missing, foul play not suspected. The article was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Dr. Thorne had been reported missing by his sister when he failed to appear for Christmas dinner. His car was found at O'Hare Airport, keys in the ignition, a plane ticket to Vancouver in his name unused at the gate. Professor Thorne had been under considerable stress related to academic disputes, an unnamed university spokesperson was quoted as saying. This appears to be a case of someone needing to start fresh somewhere else. But there was no trail after that. No credit card usage, no bank withdrawals, no rental agreements or employment records under his name, or any obvious aliases. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years building a paper trail of academic achievement, had simply evaporated. Mara closed her eyes in the sterile library lighting, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The systematic silencing hadn't been limited to Dr. Thorne. As she continued her research, she found a pattern of structural engineers, metallurgists, and physics professors who had raised questions about the official collapse narrative in those crucial first months after the attacks. All of them had faced professional consequences. All of them had been marginalised, defunded, or discredited, and all of them had eventually stopped asking questions about September 11th. The few who continued their research had moved to other countries, found positions in private industry, or simply disappeared from the academic record entirely. What remained was a consensus not of discovery but of survival, a scientific community that had learned, through selective pressure and systematic intimidation, that certain questions would not be tolerated. The official story wasn't just the accepted version of events, it was the only version that was professionally survivable. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the library, Mara felt exposed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The paranoia was no longer abstract. It was a physical sensation, a cold certainty that she was being observed, catalogued, evaluated for the threat she might represent. The knowledge she was accumulating had a price, she realised, and others had already paid it. The question now was whether she would be added to the list of people who had learned too much for their own good. The feeling of being watched had evolved from paranoia into operational security. Mara began varying her routines, taking different routes home, using cash for purchases, and conducting her most sensitive research from internet cafes and public libraries, rather than her home computer. She had read enough about surveillance to know that once you were on someone's radar, digital footprints became roadmaps to your location and intentions. She also began using layered VPNs, routing her internet traffic through servers in countries with strong privacy laws, and communicating through encrypted channels that existed in the shadow spaces of the internet. Her investigation moved from mainstream archives to the digital underworld where disgruntled employees, amateur researchers, and information brokers traded in data that governments preferred to keep buried. It was in one such forum, a dark website dedicated to air disaster investigations and aviation anomalies, that she encountered the handle at Radar Ghost. His initial posts in the 9/11 section were bitter rants about cover-ups and government lies, the kind of conspiracy theorising that most serious researchers ignored. But buried in his rambling messages were technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of air traffic control systems. After weeks of careful cultivation, building trust through shared technical knowledge and encrypted private messages, at Radar Ghost agreed to share something that had haunted him for over 20 years. "This will cost me everything if it's traced back to me," he wrote, in a message encrypted with military-grade protocols. "I was working approach control at a facility that doesn't exist in any official record. We had primary radar coverage of the entire East Coast corridor. I saw things that morning that were scrubbed from every official database, but I kept copies. Insurance, you understand. Don't disappoint me." The file arrived 3 days later, a massive data dump disguised as a corrupted email attachment. When Mara finally decrypted and decompressed it, she found herself staring at 24 hours of raw primary radar returns from September 11th, 2001, not the sanitized transponder data that appeared in official reports, but the unfiltered radar reflections from every object in the sky over the eastern United States. The data was overwhelming. Commercial airliners, private jets, military aircraft, weather balloons, and the electronic noise that cluttered the airspace of the world's busiest aviation corridor. It took her days to write filtering algorithms, cleaning the data, and tracking specific radar signatures through the chaos. She focused first on American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 that had allegedly struck the Pentagon. The official story was straightforward. The flight had departed Dulles International Airport on schedule, proceeded normally for 36 minutes, then turned off its transponder over southern Ohio, made a wide U-turn back toward Washington, and descended into the Pentagon at high speed. But the raw radar data told a more complex story. The transponder signal for Flight 77 did indeed vanish over Ohio at 8:56 a.m., exactly as the official report stated. But the primary radar target, the physical reflection from the aircraft itself, continued westward for another 63 nautical miles before it simply disappeared from the screen. It didn't fade gradually or descend below radar coverage. It vanished instantly, as if the aircraft had been switched off like a light bulb. Simultaneously, a new primary target appeared on the scope near the West Virginia border, moving southeast at 540 knots toward Washington, D.C. This new radar signature had the exact characteristics of a Boeing 757. The same cross-sectional area, the same speed capabilities, the same flight profile. But according to the official timeline, the real Flight 77 was already well to the east and no longer under radar coverage. The timing was surgical in its precision. The original target disappeared at exactly 9:09:32 am. The new target appeared at 9:09:34 am, 2 seconds later and 60 miles to the south. It was as if the aircraft had been teleported, or as if one plane had been replaced by another in a carefully choreographed handoff. Radar Ghost's encrypted messages provided context. See it now? The swap. We called it aircraft substitution in our training manuals, something the military practices during war games when they need to simulate different aircraft types or flight profiles. They paint a new bird on the screen using electronic countermeasures, make the old one disappear using radar jammers. We saw what they wanted us to see. Mara cross-referenced the radar data with archived flight tracking information from that morning. The pattern became even more disturbing when she examined United Airlines Flight 175, which had struck the South Tower. Like Flight 77, its transponder signal disappeared over New Jersey, but the primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing north for another 40 miles, before vanishing and being replaced by a different target that descended into Manhattan. The implications were staggering. The radar evidence suggested that the aircraft everyone watched strike the World Trade Center and Pentagon were not the original commercial flights. They were substitutes, introduced into the airspace during the confusion of the morning's military exercises. But substitutes for what? If the original flights hadn't crashed into the buildings, what had happened to them? And what exactly had struck the towers? Her correspondence with Radar Ghost became increasingly cryptic as he realised the magnitude of what he had revealed. His final message was short and urgent. They know I've been talking. Moving the family tonight. The data you have is real, but is only part of the picture. Look for the fighter jets that weren't supposed to be there. Look for the electronic warfare signatures. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who claims to be trying to help you. The people who did this have been cleaning up loose ends for 20 years. The account at Radar Ghost went dark after that message. When Mara tried to reach him through back-channel communications, she found that all his digital identities had been systematically erased. Email accounts closed, forum profiles deleted, encrypted messaging services showing no record of his user credentials. It was as if he had never existed. But the radar data remained, a digital fossil of a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The morning of September 11th hadn't just been a terrorist attack, it had been the largest military deception operation in modern history, a shell game played with passenger aircraft while the world watched in horror. The question that now consumed Mara's every waking moment was simple and terrifying. If the planes that struck the buildings weren't the original flights, and if the original flights had been made to disappear somewhere over the American heartland, then who was responsible for the greatest aviation magic trick ever performed? And more importantly, what had happened to the 244 people who had been aboard those vanished aircraft? The scope of the deception was threatening to overwhelm her analytical capabilities. Aircraft substitution, media manipulation, academic intimidation. The threads were weaving together into a pattern so vast and complex that her rational mind struggled to process it. She needed something concrete, something that operated according to simpler rules than military operations or information warfare. She needed to follow the money. Financial markets were brutal in their honesty. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated into silence, and left paper trails that were nearly impossible to completely erase. If someone had advanced knowledge of the attacks, they would have found ways to profit from that knowledge, and those profits would be traceable. Mara spent her remaining savings on access to premium financial databases and trading analysis software. She focused on the 3 trading days immediately preceding September 11th, 2001, looking for anomalies that screamed insider knowledge. The first anomaly was so blatant it seemed impossible that it hadn't been front-page news for months. Put options, essentially bets that a stock's price would fall, had spiked to unprecedented levels for American Airlines and United Airlines stock. The volume was not just unusual, it was statistically impossible without advanced knowledge. American Airlines put options had increased by 1,300%, above normal volume on September the 6th and 7th. United Airlines puts had spiked by 1,100% over the same period. Someone had wagered hundreds of millions of dollars that these 2 specific airlines, and only these 2 airlines, were about to experience catastrophic losses. But the betting wasn't limited to the airlines. Insurance companies had been targeted with similar precision. Marsh & McLennan, the insurance brokerage that occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, had been hit with massive put option purchases. So had Swiss Re and Munich Re, two reinsurance giants that would face billions in claims from the attacks. Even more specifically, put options had been purchased against Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and other financial firms that had major offices in the World Trade Center complex. The pattern was surgical. Only companies that would be directly impacted by the destruction of the towers were targeted for bearish betting. The profits from these trades, had they been collected, would have totaled over $2.5 billion. It was the most successful short-selling operation in financial history, predicated on advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating attacks in human history. Mara traced the trading orders through a labyrinth of financial intermediaries. The initial purchases had been placed through a network of small brokerages in Germany, Switzerland and Japan, locations chosen for their bank secrecy laws and regulatory opacity. But using advanced financial forensic software, she was able to peel back the layers of financial obfuscation. The ultimate source of funding led to a Russian bank called Seveny Trust, which intelligence analysts had identified as a clearinghouse for money laundering operations tied to former Soviet intelligence services. But even that wasn't the end of the trail. The most chilling discovery came when she traced what had happened to the profits. The put options had not been exercised. In the days following September 11th, when these trades would have generated enormous profits, they had been quietly abandoned. The traders had walked away from $2.5 billion rather than claim winnings that would have created an obvious money trail leading back to the conspiracy. But Mara's analysis revealed that equivalent amounts of money had simultaneously appeared in accounts tied to defence contractors and private military companies. Blackwater, Halliburton, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, corporations that would become the primary beneficiaries of the post-9/11 military-industrial complex, had received massive, mysterious capital injections in the weeks following the attacks. The money hadn't been collected as trading profits, which would have triggered regulatory investigations. Instead, it had been recycled through a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, ultimately funding the very companies that would profit most from the subsequent war on terror. She cross-referenced this financial data with stock performance in the months following the attacks. Defence contractor stocks had exploded in value. Blackwater had grown from a small military training company to $1 billion private army. Halliburton had received no-bid contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The weapons manufacturers had seen their stock prices triple as America embarked on 2 decades of perpetual warfare. The pattern was inescapable. The same financial networks that had bet against the airlines and insurance companies had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the military response to the attacks. It was a perfect financial strategy. Short the targets, invest in the solution, then create the crisis that makes both positions profitable. But the most damning evidence came from an analysis of the timing. The put options hadn't just been purchased in the days before the attacks. They had been strategically timed to expire on September 21st, 2001, exactly 10 days after the attacks. This wasn't random speculation or lucky guessing. It was a precisely calibrated financial operation designed to maximize profits from advanced knowledge of a specific date. Mara sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. She had always imagined that if 9/11 was an inside job, it would be motivated by grand geopolitical strategy, ideological fanaticism, or the pursuit of imperial power. The reality was both more mundane and more horrifying. It was about money. The attacks weren't just a catalyst for reshaping global politics. They were the centerpiece of the most profitable investment strategy in human history. The towers had fallen, 3,000 people had died, and 2 decades of war had followed, all to execute a financial plan that had generated trillions of dollars for a small group of investors who had known exactly what was going to happen and when. She began mapping the ownership structures of the shell companies that had received the laundered profits. The network was vast and sophisticated, but patterns emerged. Many of the ultimate beneficiaries were names she recognized from business headlines. Defense industry executives, private equity firms specializing in military contractors, and investment funds that had emerged from nowhere in the early 2000s to become major players in the military-industrial complex. But one name kept appearing in her analysis, buried deep in the ownership structures and corporate boards: Meridian Group, a private investment firm that seemed to exist at the nexus of defence contracting, intelligence services and international finance. Every financial thread she followed eventually led back to companies with Meridian connections. Meridian Group had been founded in 1999 by former intelligence officials and Wall Street executives. Its public portfolio focused on emerging security technologies and crisis management solutions. But Mara's research revealed that it also held controlling interests in companies across the entire 9/11 profit chain. The defence contractors who built the weapons, the private military companies who fought the wars, the surveillance technology firms who monitored the homeland, and the financial institutions that funded the entire operation. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy, a corporate structure designed to profit from every aspect of the post-9/11 world. And if her analysis was correct, the same people who had financed the attacks had then positioned themselves to profit from the response, creating a closed loop of violence and profit that had sustained itself for over 2 decades. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided something that the other evidence had lacked: concrete proof of premeditation. Markets might be manipulated, radar might be spoofed, and media might be controlled, but money trails were nearly impossible to completely obscure. The put options were smoking gun evidence that someone had known exactly what was going to happen on September 11th and had invested billions of dollars to profit from that knowledge. As she compiled her financial research into a comprehensive report, Mara realized she was no longer just investigating a terrorist attack. She was mapping the architecture of a shadow economy built on manufactured crisis, where the same people who created the problems also owned the companies that sold the solutions. The question was no longer whether 9/11 had been an inside job. The financial evidence made that undeniable. The question was how many other crises, how many other wars, how many other national emergencies had been manufactured by the same network of investors who had learned that terror was the most profitable business on earth. The coffee cup trembles in my weathered hands as I speak these words for the first time in 53 years. My name is Detective Raymond Kowalski, retired SFPD, and I'm dying. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. But luck ran out for me the day I opened that damned Alcatraz file. They said Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The FBI closed the case. The warden slept easy. America's most infamous prison maintained its perfect record. But I found things I was never meant to see. Things that made me understand why some truths are buried deeper than bodies. This is my confession. Not of crimes I committed, but of the crime I witnessed. The systematic erasure of 3 men who may have pulled off the impossible, only to disappear into something far worse than death. If you're listening to this recording, it means I'm gone, and maybe, just maybe, the truth can finally surface from the depths where it's been drowning all these years. It was October 1968 when Lieutenant Carson dropped the manila folder on my desk like it was radioactive. 6 years had passed since the escape, and the case was supposedly closed, filed away with all the other solved mysteries that kept the bureaucrats sleeping soundly. "Formality, Kowalski," Carson said, not meeting my eyes. "Washington wants a final review of the Alcatraz evidence. Dot the I's, cross the T's, confirm what we already know. They're fish food at the bottom of the bay." I should have known something was wrong by the way he said it. Carson was a straight shooter, the kind of cop who looked you in the eye when he talked. But that day, he stared at the wall behind me like the words might crawl off it and bite him. The file was thinner than I expected for the most famous prison break in American history. Basic escape details, witness statements from guards, the makeshift raft materials found on Angel Island. Nothing I hadn't read in the newspapers. Too clean, too neat. "Why me?" I asked. Carson finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Because you're thorough, maybe too thorough. They want this done right." He left me with those cryptic words and a growing certainty that this formality was anything but routine. I started with the obvious inconsistencies. The first was a car theft report from Marina District, filed 3 days after the escape. A 1959 Chevrolet, stolen from outside a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, told police she saw 3 men walking away from the vehicle, heading toward the waterfront. When she called out to them, one turned and tipped his hat. "Polite as you please." "They had manners," she told the responding officer. "Real gentlemen. You don't expect that from criminals." The report was buried on page 47 of miscellaneous incident files. No follow-up, no investigation, no mention in the official Alcatraz case summary. Then there was the paddle, a crude wooden oar carved from driftwood, found by a fisherman near Richmond Bridge, 20 miles upriver from where the currents should have carried any debris. The fisherman, Miguel Santos, reported it to park rangers, who logged it as miscellaneous beach debris. No connection made to the escape, despite the timing and craftsmanship that clearly showed prison workshop techniques. But it was the witness statement that made my blood run cold. A night security guard at Fisherman's Wharf reported seeing 3 men in work clothes boarding a small fishing boat around 4 a.m. on June 12th. One of them had distinctive ears, prominent, almost pointed, just like John Anglin's mugshot description. The guard's statement was taken, filed, and apparently forgotten. When I tried to interview him, I learned he'd quit his job 2 weeks after the incident and moved back to Oregon. No forwarding address. "Don't dig too deep on this one, Ray," Carson warned me when I briefed him on my preliminary findings. "Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than a prison break. The Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida felt like stepping into a different century. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the humid air carried the scent of orange blossoms and old secrets. Robert Anglin, the surviving brother, met me on the front porch with the wary eyes of a man who'd been expecting bad news for 6 years. "Federal agents been by here 4 times, he said without preamble, each time asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "My brother's drowned. That's what you want to hear, ain't it?" But his wife, Marie, had different ideas. After Robert went to tend the cattle, she pulled me aside in her kitchen, glancing nervously at the windows. "Christmas cards," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. "Every year since '63, no return address, just signed J&C in handwriting that looks mighty familiar." She showed me a shoebox filled with holiday cards, generic drugstore variety, postmarked from different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Mexico City. The handwriting was careful, disguised, but there were telltale loops and slants that matched samples I'd obtained from the prison records. "Why haven't you told the FBI?" I asked. Marie's laugh was bitter. "You think we haven't tried? First agent said they were hoaxes. Second one confiscated them as evidence. Third one threatened to charge us with obstruction if we kept spreading false hope. These here are copies I made before they took the originals." Photographs came out next. 3 pictures, slightly blurry, showing 2 men in work shirts standing outside what appeared to be a South American cantina. The faces were partially obscured by shadows and hat brims, but the bone structure, the posture, the way one man favoured his left leg, it all matched the Anglin brothers' physical profiles. Woman from church. Her daughter married a missionary. Sent these from Brazil in '65, Marie explained. Said these 2 Americans worked construction jobs, paid cash, kept to themselves, spoke English with Florida accents. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The man on the left had a distinctive scar on his forearm, a scar I remembered from Clarence Anglin's prison medical records, sustained in a workshop accident at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. "FBI says they're look-alikes," Marie continued. "Coincidence, but a mother knows her son's detective. Even in shadows, even across oceans, those are my boys." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of grief or false hope. It was the fear of someone who knew more than she was saying, someone who'd been warned to keep quiet. As I left the farm that evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked down the country road, 2 figures visible in the front seats. When I drove past, they turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of federal license plates. The Anglins were being watched. After 6 years, the dead men's family was still under surveillance. That night in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd gathered so far. The car theft, the paddle, the witness statements, the cards and photographs. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Together, they painted a picture that made my hands shake as I wrote my preliminary report. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't drowned in San Francisco Bay. They'd made it to shore, stolen transportation, and somehow managed to disappear into the wind. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether they'd survived the escape. It was why the government was so determined to pretend they hadn't. The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. has the kind of institutional grandeur designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I walked through its marble corridors in November 1968, carrying my credentials and a growing list of questions, I felt exactly as intended. The records clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallor of someone who spent his days in basement filing rooms, greeted my request with practiced bureaucratic indifference. "Alcatraz escape files? Let me check the catalogue." He disappeared into the labyrinthine storage system, returning 20 minutes later with a puzzled frown. "That's odd. The primary files show as transferred to federal custody in 1964, no longer available for review." "Transferred where?" "Doesn't say. Just lists the authorization code. Project Paperclip Archive classified." Project Paperclip. Even a street cop from San Francisco knew that designation. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II. Why would an escape case be filed under intelligence classifications? What about the secondary files, witness statements, evidence logs? Another search, another apologetic shrug. Also transferred, same authorization. I spent 3 days in Washington, following leads that turned to smoke and asking questions that generated only nervous silence. At FBI headquarters, my request for case consultation was politely denied. At the Bureau of Prisons, I was told the relevant personnel were unavailable for comment. Even my police credentials and Lieutenant Carson's authorization letters seemed to carry no weight. It was Agent Patricia Hendricks, a bureau analyst I'd worked with on a previous case, who finally gave me the truth over drinks in a Georgetown bar. She waited until we were alone, until the other patrons had cleared out, until even the bartender was busy with inventory in the back room. "Ray, you need to drop this," she said quietly, her usual professional demeanour replaced by genuine concern. "The Alcatraz case isn't cold. It's radioactive." "What does that mean?" Patricia glanced around the empty bar before continuing. Internal memo came down in 65. Any agent pursuing Alcatraz leads beyond the official drowning conclusion would be transferred to Alaska or worse. 3 agents have been quietly reassigned since then. Good agents, career agents, all because they asked too many questions about 3 supposedly dead men. Why? If they drowned like the report says, what's the threat? Her laugh was hollow. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? All I know is that certain people in very high places want Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers to stay dead, and they're willing to destroy careers to keep it that way. She slid an envelope across the table. I couldn't get you the files, but I managed to copy some of the index pages before they were sealed. Names, dates, reference numbers. Maybe you can piece together what we're not supposed to know. The documents were fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. Cross-references to CIA front companies, mentions of asset recovery protocol, transfer authorizations signed by officials whose names I recognised from the intelligence community. Most disturbing was a memo dated July 1962, just 1 month after the escape. Subjects may possess operational value. Recommend immediate field assessment rather than standard fugitive protocols. Operational value, not the language you'd use for bank robbers and car thieves. That night, in my Washington hotel room, I called Lieutenant Carson to report my findings. The conversation was brief and cryptic. "Ray, you need to come home. Now. I've got leads here, Lieutenant. Real leads. The leads will be there when you get back. If you get back. There are people asking questions about your questions, and those people have resources we don't. Come home." The line went dead. I packed quickly, checking the hallway twice before leaving my room. During the taxi ride to the airport, I noticed the same black sedan in my mirrors that had followed me from the archives building 3 days earlier. Back in San Francisco, Carson met me at the airport personally, something he'd never done before. His first words were a warning. "Your hotel room was searched yesterday. Professional job. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but they wanted you to know they'd been there." As we drove through the city, he filled me in on developments from my end. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who found the paddle, died in a car accident outside Portland last week. Single vehicle collision on a straight road, clear weather, and Mrs. Hutchins, the lady who saw the car theft, moved to Phoenix, left no forwarding address. Her old neighbours say federal agents visited her the day before she left. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone connected to evidence contradicting the official narrative was disappearing, voluntarily or otherwise. The Alcatraz case wasn't just closed, it was being actively suppressed by people with resources and authority I couldn't match. "What do I do, Lieutenant?" Carson pulled over and turned to face me. In 30 years of police work, I'd never seen him look so serious. "You write a report confirming the drowning theory. You file it properly. You forget everything you've learned, and you pray that's enough to keep you breathing." But I couldn't forget. The faces in those photographs. The fear in Mary Anglin's eyes. The systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Somewhere out there, the truth was buried so deep that powerful people were willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden. The question was whether I was brave enough, or stupid enough, to keep digging. Tony the Fish Marconi wasn't the kind of informant you'd find in a police procedural manual. A small-time smuggler with ties to both San Francisco's waterfront and various federal agencies that preferred not to be named, Tony survived by knowing when to talk and when to disappear. When he agreed to meet me at a dive bar in North Beach, I knew the information would be worth the risk. "You're playing with fire, detective," he said, stirring his whiskey with a nicotine-stained finger. "The Alcatraz thing? That ain't just a prison break, that's connected to some heavy government business." "What kind of business?" Tony glanced around the dim bar, noting the exits, the other patrons, the bartender's attention. Old habits from a life lived in the shadows. "You ever hear of something called the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Private contractors, black budget operations, the kind of people who make problems disappear for Uncle Sam. Word on the street is they were running recruitment out of the Bay Area in the early 60s, looking for specific types, intelligent, adaptable, morally flexible, men who'd already proven they could operate outside the law." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying Morris and the Anglins were recruited?" I'm saying Morris had an IQ of 133 and a talent for planning that impressed even the prison psychologists. The Anglin brothers were mechanical geniuses who could improvise solutions from scrap metal and determination. During the Cold War, those were valuable skills. Tony drained his whiskey and signalled for another. Think about it. 3 men plan the perfect escape from America's most secure prison. They disappear without a trace, despite the biggest manhunt in federal history. Either they're criminal masterminds beyond anything we've seen, or they had help. Professional help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with new identities, transportation, and assignments in places where questions aren't asked. South America was crawling with intelligence operations in the 60s. Cuba, Chile, Brazil, all potential flashpoints that needed experienced operators who couldn't be traced back to Washington. The theory was insane, but it explained the evidence I'd uncovered. The systematic suppression of information, the classified file transfers, the fear I'd encountered at every level of government. If the Alcatraz escape had been a recruitment operation disguised as a prison break, then admitting the men survived would expose a covert program that violated everything America claimed to stand for. There's another possibility, Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Maybe they weren't recruited. Maybe they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Such as... Alcatraz was more than a prison detective. It was a research facility, mind control experiments, interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical trials, the kind of work that required subjects who couldn't complain to their congressman. What if Morris and the Anglins saw something during their time there? What if their escape wasn't about freedom, it was about exposure? My mind reeled with the implications. If the escapees had witnessed classified experiments, their capture wouldn't result in a return to prison. It would result in permanent silence. I've heard whispers, Tony continued. Black sites in Nevada, facilities that don't appear on any government maps, places where inconvenient people go to be forgotten, the kind of places where 3 escaped prisoners might end up if they knew too much. He finished his second whiskey and stood to leave. One more thing, Detective. You know why they call it the Prometheus Group? I shook my head. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The gods punished him by chaining him to a rock where eagles ate his liver for eternity. Some gifts come with a price that never stops being paid. After Tony left, I sat in that dim bar for another hour, trying to process what he'd told me. 3 theories, each more disturbing than the last. Theory 1, Cold War recruitment. The escape was facilitated by intelligence agencies looking for deniable assets. Morris and the Anglins were extracted, given new identities, and deployed to international hotspots where their criminal skills could serve national interests. Theory 2, witness protection in reverse. The men had seen classified activities at Alcatraz and escaped to avoid being silenced. Their continued existence threatened to expose government programs that officially didn't exist. Theory 3, the darkest possibility. They were captured alive after the escape and disappeared into the black site system, spending the rest of their lives as test subjects or interrogation practice for intelligence agencies that viewed them as expendable assets. Each theory explained the evidence I'd gathered. Each theory justified the extreme measures taken to suppress the truth. And each theory meant that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced something far worse than drowning in San Francisco Bay. They faced erasure from history itself. 6 months later, against direct orders from Lieutenant Carson and my own better judgment, I found myself on a flight to Rio de Janeiro. The lead had come through Tony Marconi's network, a bartender in Ipanema who claimed to remember 2 American men matching the Anglin's description, regulars at his establishment from 1971 to 1978. They paid cash, spoke little Portuguese, and never talked about their past, the bartender Carlos told me through a translator. But they were different from other expatriates, more careful, always watching the exits, never sitting with their backs to the door. The description matched surveillance training, the kind of operational security taught to intelligence assets. Carlos produced a photograph taken during a Christmas party in 1975, a grainy image showing 2 men at the edge of the celebration, their faces partially obscured but their body language unmistakably American. My hands trembled as I studied the picture. The man on the left had the same jawline, the same ears, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd memorised from Clarence Anglin's prison files. The other figure showed signs of premature ageing, stress lines and grey hair that suggested a life lived under constant tension. "What happened to them?" I asked. Carlos's expression darkened. "They left suddenly, in the middle of the night. One day they were here, the next day their apartment was empty. The landlord said men in suits had come asking questions the week before, Americans but not tourists, government men." I spent another week in Rio following leads that grew colder with each passing day. The apartment building where the mystery Americans had lived was scheduled for demolition, its records mysteriously lost in a fire. The bank where they had allegedly maintained accounts had no record of American customers from that period. Every trail ended in convenient dead ends and missing documentation. On my final night in Brazil, I was approached by a man claiming to be a freelance journalist who'd been investigating the same story. We met at a beachside cafe in Copacabana, the sound of waves masking our conversation from potential surveillance. "You're the American detective asking about the Alcatraz escapees," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I neither confirmed nor denied, waiting for him to continue. "I've been working this story for 3 years," he said, "following reports of American fugitives throughout South America. The trail is real, detective, too real. These men lived here, worked here, built lives here. But every time I get close to proof, the sources disappear, witnesses relocate, documents vanish. I've had my hotel room searched, my phone tapped, my sources intimidated." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is everything I've gathered. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, hidden in different locations for 3 years, copied and recopied to prevent loss. It's yours now." "Why?" "Because I'm done." Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men with American accents and no identification. They politely suggested that my investigation was endangering people I cared about. They showed me photographs of my sister's children playing in a park in Sao Paulo. Very clear photographs. Very recent photographs. The envelope contained a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records showing regular deposits to accounts held by men with obviously false Brazilian identities. Employment records from construction companies that had hired American workers without proper documentation. Hotel registries with signatures that bore striking resemblances to handwriting samples I'd obtained from Alcatraz. Most compelling was a photograph dated 1976 showing 3 men at a construction site in the Amazon basin. 2 matched the Anglin brothers' physical descriptions. The third was older, lean, with the kind of penetrating stare I remembered from Frank Morris's mugshot. All 3 wore work clothes and hard hats, looking like ordinary labourers except for their distinctly American postures and expressions. But like every other lead I'd followed, this one ended in frustration and fear. When I tried to contact the construction company, I learned it had been dissolved in 1979. The site where the photograph was taken was now underwater, flooded by a dam project that had relocated the entire local population. The pattern was always the same. Evidence of survival followed by systematic elimination of that evidence. Either I was chasing ghosts or someone with vast resources was staying one step ahead of every investigation. My flight back to San Francisco was delayed by mysterious mechanical problems. During the 6-hour layover in Mexico City, I noticed the same 2 men in different locations throughout the terminal. Always at a distance, always watching, never making direct contact. When I finally boarded the plane, they weren't among the passengers. Lieutenant Carson met me at San Francisco International with news that made my blood run cold. "Federal marshals raided your apartment yesterday, Ray. Warrant signed by a judge I've never heard of, for evidence in a case they wouldn't specify. They took everything, your files, your notes, your photographs, everything connected to Alcatraz." In the car ride home, he handed me an official-looking document. "Transfer orders, effective immediately. You're being reassigned to the robbery division. Your Alcatraz investigation is officially terminated." "On whose authority?" "Authority high enough that questioning it would end both our careers." Carson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Ray, I've been a cop for 28 years. I've seen corruption, cover-ups and conspiracies, but I've never seen anything like this. The pressure to shut you down is coming from levels of government I didn't know existed." He pulled over in a secluded area of Golden Gate Park and turned to face me directly. "Whatever you found down there, whatever you think you know, it's not worth your life. These people have made careers disappear for asking the wrong questions. They can make people disappear too." As he spoke, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past us, its occupants clearly visible through tinted windows that somehow allowed us to see their faces while hiding their expressions. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, our conversation monitored, our future actions carefully noted. That night, alone in my ransacked apartment, I realised the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just a cover-up of a prison escape. It was the systematic suppression of a truth so dangerous that the most powerful government in the world was willing to destroy lives to protect it. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't just escaped from Alcatraz. They'd escaped into a shadow world where truth became enemy of the state, where survival meant accepting lies, and where the greatest prison of all was the silence that surrounded their fate. But silence, I was beginning to understand, has its own way of speaking to those willing to listen. 25 years passed like pages torn from a calendar and scattered by the wind. I worked robbery division, collected my pension, and tried to convince myself that some truths were better left buried. The Alcatraz case became a ghost that haunted my dreams, 3 faces staring at me from the depths of San Francisco Bay, asking why I'd abandoned the search for their story. Then came January 2013, and a letter that changed everything. The History Channel documentary was running old Alcatraz footage when the phone rang. It was my former partner, Jimmy Chen, now working cold cases for the FBI. His voice carried the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. "Ray, you need to see this. Someone sent a letter to the Bureau claiming to be John Anglin. Says he's dying of cancer, wants to make a deal. Information about the escape in exchange for medical treatment." My hands shook as I read the photocopied letter Jimmy brought to my house that evening. The handwriting was shaky with age and illness, but certain flourishes matched the Christmas cards Marie Anglin had shown me decades earlier. The details were specific, accurate, insider knowledge that only someone who'd lived through the escape could possess. "It's a hoax," Jimmy said, watching my reaction. "Has to be. FBI handwriting analysis says inconclusive. Could be authentic, could be someone who studied the case extensively." But I knew better. The letter wasn't just about the escape. It mentioned details that had never been made public. References to guard rotation patterns that were classified. Descriptions of cell modifications that weren't in any official report. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd lived through those final months of preparation. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "The letter mentions a meeting place, coordinates in the Bay Area, where supposedly Frank Morris left something hidden before the escape. Information that was too dangerous to carry. The writer claims it's still there, waiting for someone brave enough to look." The coordinates led to a section of Angel Island State Park, near the spot where the makeshift raft materials had been found 51 years earlier. Against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I found myself hiking those trails the following weekend, searching for something I couldn't name. It was hidden in a cave that didn't appear on any park maps, sealed behind rocks that looked natural but showed tool marks when examined closely. A waterproof container, military surplus from the 1960s, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Guard schedules from Alcatraz, annotated with personal notes about corruption and smuggling operations. Photographs of prison officials meeting with men in expensive suits who didn't appear in any government directories. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to wardens and guards who lived far beyond their official salaries. Most damning was a handwritten journal in Frank Morris's distinctive script, documenting what he'd witnessed during his time at Alcatraz. The prison wasn't just housing criminals, it was housing witnesses to government activities that violated constitutional protections. Political prisoners who'd been disappeared from the mainland. Foreign nationals being held without diplomatic notification. Test subjects for psychological experiments that would later be revealed as part of the MKUltra program. The final entry, dated 2 days before the escape, was prophetic in its certainty. We're not breaking out to be free, we're breaking out to stay alive. What we know, what we've seen, makes us more dangerous to them than any criminal they've ever housed. If we stay, we disappear quietly. If we escape and get caught, we disappear loudly. Our only chance is to vanish completely and hope the truth survives us. The documents explained everything. The official insistence on the drowning theory, the suppression of evidence, the systematic elimination of witnesses. The Alcatraz escape wasn't a crime to be solved. It was a national security incident to be contained. Morris and the Anglins hadn't just witnessed classified activities. They documented them, created a record of government crimes that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Their escape was both an act of desperation and a gamble that someday someone would be brave enough to tell their story. Reading those pages in the dim light of that hidden cave, I finally understood the true scope of the self-destruction paradox. The very actions taken to hide the truth had preserved it. The efforts to silence witnesses had created evidence. The attempts to erase history had documented it in detail. But understanding the truth and proving it were different challenges entirely. The men who'd orchestrated the cover-up were dead or retired, their crimes protected by classification systems and institutional amnesia. The witnesses were gone, scattered or silenced by 5 decades of systematic intimidation. Yet the letter kept haunting me. Someone claiming to be John Anglin, dying and desperate, reaching out across 50 years of silence to offer one final revelation. The FBI had dismissed it as a hoax, but their dismissal felt too quick, too certain, too reminiscent of the patterns I'd seen decades earlier. Late at night, when the pain in my chest reminded me of my own mortality, I wondered about the fates of 3 men who'd gambled everything on an impossible escape. Had they found freedom in the jungles of South America? Had they lived out their days under assumed names, carrying secrets too dangerous to share? Or had they been caught, disappeared into black sites where their knowledge died with them? The letter writer claimed John Anglin had survived into the 21st century, living with the weight of knowledge that could never be shared, watching as history branded him a criminal, while the real criminals wore badges and held office. If true, it was a torture more cruel than any prison cell, to know the truth and be unable to speak it, to carry justice in your heart while injustice wore your name. I kept the documents for 6 months before making my decision. They couldn't stay hidden. Too many people had died to protect these secrets, and too many others deserved to know the truth. But releasing them publicly would accomplish nothing except getting me killed and the evidence destroyed. Instead, I chose a different path. I copied everything, hid the copies in locations scattered across the country, and left instructions for their release upon my death. If the government wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to do it posthumously, when I could no longer be intimidated or eliminated. The original documents I returned to their hiding place on Angel Island, along with my own written account of the investigation. Future generations might find them, might understand what they represented, might finally give Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers the justice they'd been denied for over half a century. But justice, I was learning, was a luxury the living could rarely afford. It was a gift we could only leave for the dead, a truth we could only speak when our own voices had been silenced. The morphine makes it difficult to focus, but I need to finish this recording while I still can. The doctors say hours now, maybe a day if I'm stubborn enough to fight the inevitable. I've been fighting for 78 years. What's one more battle against the darkness? I've spent 53 years carrying the weight of what I learned about Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. 53 years of waking up in cold sweats, wondering if today would be the day federal agents knocked on my door with a permanent solution to my inconvenient knowledge. 53 years of looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror, and jumping at unexpected phone calls. The truth is a heavy burden when you're carrying it alone. I don't know if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived out their days in Brazilian freedom, sipping caipirinhas on Ipanema Beach and laughing at the federal agents who'd spent decades searching for their corpses. I don't know if they died namelessly in some government facility, their final words lost in soundproof rooms designed to swallow screams. But I do know this with absolute certainty. They didn't drown in San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The evidence was always there for anyone brave enough to look past the official narrative. The car theft, the witness statements, the photographs from South America, the Christmas cards signed with familiar initials, each piece individually dismissed as coincidence or hoax, but collectively forming a picture of survival that powerful people needed to deny. The government's insistence on the drowning theory wasn't about maintaining Alcatraz's reputation or protecting prison security. It was about hiding activities that violated every principle America claimed to represent. The research programs, the intelligence operations, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all of it justified by national security classifications that turned constitutional protections into classified waste paper. Morris and the Anglins weren't just criminals who pulled off the perfect escape. They were inconvenient witnesses to state-sanctioned crimes, men whose continued existence threatened to expose a shadow government that operated beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Their escape became their crime, their knowledge became their death sentence, their survival became a national security threat that required decades of cover-ups, intimidation, and murder to contain. I've left evidence of everything I'd discovered, hidden in multiple locations protected by legal arrangements that will trigger automatic release upon my death. Some truths are too important to die with the men who discover them. The morphine is winning now, and the room is getting darker. But before I fade away, I want to leave you with this final thought. Alcatraz was never escape-proof because its walls were too high or its waters too cold. It was escape-proof because the government made survival more dangerous than imprisonment, freedom more terrifying than captivity. The greatest prison isn't built with stone and steel. It's built with silence and fear, with official denials and convenient accidents, with careers destroyed and witnesses disappeared. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't die in San Francisco Bay. The Bay didn't kill them. The silence did. And silence. Silence is the strongest prison of all. But even silence eventually comes to an end. Recording ends with the sound of steady breathing that gradually grows fainter, until only the mechanical hum of hospital equipment remains. Found among Detective Raymond Kowalski's personal effects, along with detailed instructions for the release of sealed documents and recordings. To whoever finds this recording and follows the trail I've left behind, my name was Detective Raymond Kowalski, badge number 2847, San Francisco Police Department. I died on December 20th, 2021, at 3:17 a.m., alone except for the ghosts of 3 men whose story I spent a lifetime trying to tell. If you're reading this, it means the legal mechanisms I put in place have been triggered. Safety deposit boxes in 7 different states will have been opened. Law offices in 4 different cities will have released sealed documents. Digital files stored in multiple secure locations will have been automatically transmitted to journalists, historians, and government oversight committees. I've spent 53 years preparing for this moment, the moment when my voice could finally break the silence that has protected one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. The documents you now have access to represent only a fraction of what was hidden. For every piece of evidence I managed to preserve, dozens more were destroyed by people who understood that truth was their greatest enemy. But what remains is enough. Enough to prove that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape from Alcatraz. Enough to demonstrate the systematic suppression of evidence by multiple government agencies. Enough to show that the official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect state secrets more valuable than human lives. I need you to understand something. The men who orchestrated this cover-up weren't comic book villains twirling their mustaches in shadowy rooms. They were patriots in their own minds. They believed that protecting classified operations was more important than acknowledging 3 escaped prisoners. They convinced themselves that national security justified any level of deception, any amount of witness intimidation, any degree of evidence suppression. They were wrong. In a democracy, truth cannot be classified indefinitely. Justice cannot be postponed forever. The families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers deserve to know their fates. The American people deserved to know what their government did in their name. History deserved an accurate record, not a convenient fiction. I've carried this burden alone because I was afraid. afraid of losing my pension, my reputation, my life, afraid of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disgruntled cop, afraid that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except getting me killed. But fear, I've learned, is just another form of prison, and like Alcatraz itself, it's only escape-proof as long as you believe the walls are stronger than your determination to break free. To the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, your loved ones were not the criminals history has made them out to be. They were witnesses to government crimes who paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. Whether they found freedom in South America or died in government custody, they deserved better than 50 years of official denial and systematic character assassination. To the government officials who will undoubtedly attempt to discredit these revelations, your time is over. The men who created this cover-up are dead. The operations they were protecting have been declassified or exposed through other channels. The only thing your continued denials accomplish is further damage to public trust in institutions that have already lost too much credibility. To the historians and journalists who will investigate these claims, be careful, be thorough, be brave. The people who killed witnesses and destroyed evidence may be gone, but the systems they created to protect state secrets remain in place. Truth-telling is still a dangerous profession in America. To Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, wherever your final resting places may be, your story is finally being told. Your truth is finally being spoken. Your silence is finally being broken. You escaped from Alcatraz on June 11th, 1962. You survived the waters of San Francisco Bay. You lived beyond that night, whatever your ultimate fates may have been. History will remember you not as the criminals who failed to escape, but as the men who succeeded too well for the government's comfort. Your greatest escape wasn't from prison. It was from the official narrative that tried to erase you from history. That escape, at least, was permanent. Final statement for the record. I, Detective Raymond Kowalski, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby swear under oath that every statement in this recording and its accompanying documents represents the truth as I discovered it through my official investigation into the Alcatraz escape of 1962. I have knowingly risked my career, my safety, and my life to preserve this information. I have done so not for personal gain or professional advancement, but because I believe that in a democracy, truth belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who find it inconvenient. If my death occurs under suspicious circumstances, if these documents are somehow suppressed or discredited, if this recording mysteriously disappears, let it stand as evidence that the cover-up I've documented continues to claim lives. But if this message reaches you intact, if the truth I've preserved finally sees daylight, then maybe, just maybe, the strongest prison of all has finally been breached. The silence is broken, the truth is free, and Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers can finally rest in peace, knowing their story has been told. Badge 2847, signing off for the final time. What if I told you that the world as you know it ended on December 31st, 1999? That everything since then has been a carefully constructed backup simulation? Before you click away, consider this. How many times have you experienced déjà vu? How often does history feel wrong somehow? The Mandela effect isn't just misremembering, it's the cracks showing through. Tonight's story comes from the encrypted files of a systems hacker who claimed to witness the greatest cover-up in human history. His digital footprint was scrubbed from existence, but fragments remain. What you're about to read is his confession. If you're brave enough to question reality itself, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what conspiracy you want me to investigate next. But be warned, some truths come with a price. They told us nothing happened on New Year's Eve 1999, that 2K was a myth, an overblown panic created by paranoid programmers and opportunistic consultants. The computers didn't crash, the planes didn't fall from the sky, and civilization didn't collapse into chaos. We all woke up on January 1st, 2000, relieved and slightly embarrassed by our collective anxiety. But I know better. I watched the world end from behind a glowing monitor. The faint hum of my desktop computer fills the silence of my childhood bedroom as I type these words. Outside, I can still hear the distant echo of fireworks. Or maybe that's just the memory replaying in an endless loop. The flickering desk lamp casts dancing shadows on the wall, and in those shadows, I see the truth that everyone else has forgotten. I wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist. I wasn't one of those doomsday preppers hoarding canned goods and bottled water. I was a 17-year-old systems hacker with backdoor access into networks that most people didn't even know existed. I had my fingers on the pulse of the digital world's nervous system, and at 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, I felt it flatline. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, insane even. But I have proof. Fragments of code that shouldn't exist, screenshots of systems that deny their own history, and memories of a world that no longer remembers itself. The evidence is disappearing bit by bit, file by file, as the system cleans up after itself. Soon, there will be nothing left but this confession, and maybe not even that. The world I remember from before the reset was darker than what we have now, more chaotic, more real. In that original timeline, the Columbine shooting had claimed dozens more victims. The dot-com bubble had burst 6 months earlier, triggering a global recession that made the 2008 crisis look like a minor correction. Princess Diana had survived her car crash, but lived as a vegetable, sparking years of bitter custody battles over her care. The Cold War had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground, festering into proxy conflicts that threatened to escalate into nuclear exchange. By December 1999, the world was teetering on multiple precipices simultaneously. Environmental collapse, economic meltdown, and political instability were converging into a perfect storm that would have ended human civilization within a decade. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Mass fish die-offs that presaged oceanic ecosystem collapse, currency fluctuations that indicated coordinated attacks on the global financial system, and satellite imagery showing military build-ups in regions that the media wasn't covering. I had stumbled onto evidence of these brewing catastrophes through my digital wanderings. Corporate databases full of environmental data that painted a picture of imminent ecological death. Classified military communications discussing acceptable losses in potential nuclear exchanges, and economic models that all pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had maybe 5 years left before everything fell apart. That's why the reset made sense. Someone or something had looked at the trajectory we were on and decided that the only way to save us was to start over, to roll back reality to a stable checkpoint and rewrite the variables that were leading to our destruction. But every correction came with a cost. Every disaster prevented meant people who should have existed were edited out of the timeline. Every war avoided meant heroes who would have emerged from that conflict never got their chance to inspire others. Every economic collapse prevented meant innovations born from necessity were never created. The world became safer, more stable, more predictable. But it also became less authentic. less human, somehow. I sat alone in my dark bedroom at 11:58 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, bathed in the blue glow of my CRT monitor. The ancient Packard Bell computer hummed and clicked with the sound of mechanical hard drives that would soon be obsolete. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through layers of security that had taken me months to understand and bypass. While the rest of the world prepared to celebrate the new millennium, I was deep inside a NORAD shadow server, navigating through layers of outdated relay nodes that dated back to the Cold War. The government had never bothered to properly decommission the old systems. They just built new ones on top, leaving digital fossils buried in the architecture like archaeological layers. The pathway I had discovered was almost embarrassingly simple once you knew where to look. The 1960s-era communication protocols were still active in many systems, maintained by automated processes that no living person fully understood. These ghost networks carried data that was invisible to modern monitoring systems, creating a parallel internet that existed in the spaces between official infrastructure. Finding my way into these forgotten networks had become something of an obsession. The 1980s military code was surprisingly vulnerable, written in an era when security through obscurity was considered sufficient. Most of the original programmers were long gone, retired or dead, taking their knowledge of backdoors and exploits with them. But I had patience, and I had time. Outside my window I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration. Champagne corks popping, people laughing, the countdown beginning on someone's television. Dick Clark's voice drifted through the thin walls of our suburban house, that familiar cadence building toward the moment that would change everything. The normal world, the surface world, was ready to welcome the future with open arms. But down here, in the digital underground, something else was stirring. My screen showed a directory listing of files with names that made no sense, strings of numbers and letters that followed no naming convention I recognised. Some were dated years in the future, others claimed to be from decades in the past. It was as if the system's internal clock had become unstuck in time, unsure of when it was supposed to be. The deeper I dug into the file structure, the more bizarre it became. I found databases that claimed to contain population records for cities that didn't exist, weather monitoring data from regions that weren't on any map. Even stranger were the personnel files, military service records for soldiers whose serial numbers followed no standard format, deployment orders to bases with names that returned no results when I searched for them. At 11:59 p.m, I noticed something strange. The network traffic began to slow, not in the way you'd expect from system overload, but like a river gradually freezing. Commands that should have executed instantly took seconds, then minutes to complete. It was as if the entire digital infrastructure was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The countdown outside grew louder. 10, 9, 8. I watched my monitor, waiting for something to happen. In the hacker community, we'd been joking about Y2K for months. The idea that computers would suddenly think it was 1900 and bring civilization to its knees seemed almost quaint. We knew better. We understood how date systems worked, how programmers had already patched the critical vulnerabilities. Y2K would be a non-event, a collective sigh of relief followed by sheepish admissions of overreaction. But something was different about the systems I was monitoring. These weren't normal corporate databases or government servers. These were deeper, older, connected to infrastructure that predated modern computing entirely. Some of the code I was seeing appeared to be written in languages that shouldn't have existed, hybrid programming constructs that combined elements from different eras of computing in ways that should have been impossible. 7, 6, 5. My screen flickered. Just once, so briefly I almost missed it. But in that moment of darkness I saw something that made my blood freeze. For just an instant the command prompter displayed text in a font I'd never seen before, characters that looked almost hieroglyphic before snapping back to normal. 4, 3, 2. The network traffic stopped completely, not slowed, stopped. The data streams I'd been monitoring flatlined into perfect silence. Every connection I had established went dead simultaneously, as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire internet. but my computer was still running, still connected to something, because the screen continued to display data that was coming from nowhere. At exactly midnight my monitor went black, not the blue-black of a normal shutdown, but the deep, absolute black of something fundamental shutting down. The computer tower beside my desk continued to hum, the hard drive light still blinking occasionally, but the screen showed nothing. No cursor, no error message, no indication that the system was even trying to recover. Then I heard it, a low electrical hum rising from somewhere deep inside the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from my computer or any specific device, but from the house's electrical system, as if every wire was suddenly carrying more current than it was designed for. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Outside, the celebration had gone silent. I sat in perfect darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening to that electrical hum grow stronger. It wasn't quite a sound. It was more like a vibration I could feel in my bones, a frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my skull. The sensation was almost musical, like a chord being played on instruments that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The silence outside was complete now. No more voices, no more music, no more sounds of celebration. Even the ambient noise of the neighbourhood, distant traffic, air conditioning units, the constant low-level hum of modern life had vanished entirely. It was as if the world itself had paused, suspended in that moment between one year and the next. Then without warning, my monitor blazed back to life. But something was wrong. The login screen that appeared wasn't the one I'd been using. The familiar blue background had been replaced with something that hurt to look at. Not because it was bright, but because the colours seemed to exist in spectrums that my eyes weren't designed to process. The timestamps were wrong, flickering between dates that made no sense, jumping from 1999 to 2000 to 1900 and back again, as if the system couldn't decide what year it was supposed to be. The familiar NORAD directory structure I'd been navigating was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. File names that shifted and changed as I watched them, folders that appeared and disappeared without any input from me. When I tried to access familiar locations, I found myself in digital spaces that felt infinite and empty, vast server halls that contained nothing but echoes of deleted data. Outside, the sounds of celebration slowly resumed, but they seemed distant, muffled, like they were reaching me through water. When I looked out my bedroom window, the streetlights appeared dimmer than before, and the shadows they cast fell in directions that didn't match the position of the lights themselves. I tried to reconnect to the systems I'd been monitoring, but every connection failed. Not with error messages or timeout warnings. They simply didn't respond, as if the networks themselves had vanished into digital void. When I finally managed to establish a new connection, the servers I found were identical to the ones I'd been accessing, but subtly different. Files were in slightly different locations. Security protocols had minor variations. Even the system clocks, when they finally stabilised, were running exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds slow. It was as if the entire digital world had been restored from a backup that was almost, but not quite, perfect. A backup that had been created before something terrible had happened, and now that terrible thing had been prevented by simply replacing the original with the copy. But backups are never perfect. They're snapshots of a specific moment, missing the small changes and incremental updates that occurred between backup creation and system failure. In the digital world, this manifested as corrupted files and missing data. In reality itself, it manifested as gaps in memory, alterations to physical spaces, and the persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. Over the following days, I became convinced that the world had experienced something unprecedented on New Year's Eve. A complete system failure that lasted exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Not just my computer, not just my house, but everything connected to the global digital infrastructure had experienced the same blackout, the same impossible pause between one reality and the next. I started researching, reaching out to other hackers and tech enthusiasts through IRC channels and bulletin boards. Most people reported nothing unusual. They'd watched the ball drop, celebrated with friends and woken up with hangovers on New Year's Day. But a very few, mentioned strange experiences that matched elements of what I had witnessed. A systems administrator in Tokyo reported that all of his servers had simultaneously rebooted at midnight, displaying bizarre error messages in languages that didn't exist before returning to normal operation. The error messages were written in characters that resembled Chinese or Japanese, but when he showed them to linguists, they insisted the symbols followed no known grammatical rules. More disturbing still, the servers had somehow completed months of scheduled maintenance during those few minutes of downtime. Updates that should have taken hours had been implemented instantaneously. A telecommunications engineer in London noticed that several international communication satellites had briefly disappeared from tracking systems, reappearing minutes later with no explanation from the agencies that monitored them. During the blackout period, the satellites had somehow changed position in ways that defied orbital mechanics, moving distances that should have required months of careful trajectory adjustments. When he reported the anomaly to his supervisors, he was told that the tracking data must have been corrupted and to delete his observations. But the most compelling evidence came from the financial markets. During those 7 minutes and 44 seconds, something extraordinary had happened to the global economy. Thousands of transactions had simply vanished, not cancelled or reversed, but erased from existence as if they had never occurred. Bank records showed gaps, trading logs had missing entries, and entire portfolios had been mysteriously altered. Most financial institutions dismissed these anomalies as minor Y2K-related glitches, quickly covered by insurance and forgotten. But I found patterns in the deletions that suggested something far more systematic. The vanished transactions weren't random. They followed specific criteria, as if some vast intelligence had been selectively editing the financial record. Companies that had been on the verge of bankruptcy suddenly found their books balanced through the mysterious disappearance of debt obligations. Predatory loans that would have destroyed families had vanished from mortgage databases. Stock manipulations that would have triggered market crashes had been erased, leaving no trace of the insider trading that should have been prosecuted. Nations whose economies were being destroyed by currency speculation found their exchange rates mysteriously stabilised. Sovereign debt that would have led to political upheaval had been reduced or eliminated entirely. Even individual account holders found unexpected changes. Overdraft fees reversed, credit card debts reduced, student loans modified with better terms. It was as if someone, or something, had used the Y2K transition as cover for the largest financial restructuring in human history, systematically eliminating the economic pressures that were pushing civilization toward collapse. But the changes went beyond money. Civil registry data had been altered in subtle but significant ways that suggested a comprehensive rewriting of recent history. Birth records, death certificates, immigration documents, all had been modified according to patterns I couldn't fully decipher, but which seemed designed to reduce social tensions and prevent future conflicts. Some people found their official birth dates had shifted by days or weeks, changing their astrological signs or moving them out of demographic categories that would have made them targets for discrimination. Others discovered that relatives they remembered had no legal record of existence, as if family members who would have created problems or inherited genetic diseases had been edited out of the bloodline entirely. Marriage records had been altered to eliminate unions that would have ended in domestic violence. Divorce papers showed different custody arrangements that better protected children. Even traffic records had been modified. DUI convictions that would have led to job losses had been reduced to lesser charges. Accident reports had been altered to reduce insurance payouts that would have bankrupted families. Maps were wrong too. Not obviously wrong. The major cities were still in the right places. The coastlines hadn't shifted dramatically. But the details were off in ways that suggested systematic urban planning improvements. Street layouts that I remembered clearly had been altered to improve traffic flow and reduce accident rates. Buildings that should have existed were absent from satellite imagery, replaced by green spaces or structures that served the community better. Even the GPS coordinates of familiar landmarks had shifted by small but measurable amounts, as if the entire continent had been nudged slightly to optimize weather patterns and reduce the frequency of natural disasters. Fault lines had been moved to reduce earthquake risk. River courses had been adjusted to prevent flooding. Coastlines had been reinforced against erosion and tsunami damage. When I tried to verify these discrepancies using archived data, I hit another wall. The backup systems that should have contained pre-Y2K records were either corrupted, missing, or showed the same alterations as the current data. It was as if the entire historical record had been systematically updated to match the new reality, eliminating any evidence that things had ever been different. Internet archives that should have contained snapshots of websites from before the reset showed pages that had been subtly modified. News articles had different headlines, different casualty figures, different outcomes to events I distinctly remembered. Even personal websites and blogs had been altered to remove references to problems that had apparently been solved before they could manifest. The most disturbing discovery came when I compared my personal files from before New Year's Eve with the official records. Photos I'd taken of friends and family showed faces that no longer matched their driver's licenses. Not dramatically different, but altered in small ways that made them more attractive, healthier, happier. Names I'd saved in my contact database belonged to people who insisted I'd always called them something else, often names that sounded more socially acceptable or carried fewer negative associations. Even academic records had been modified. Grades had been improved across the board, not to the point of absurdity, but enough to open doors that would have remained closed. Disciplinary records had been softened or eliminated. Student loan amounts had been reduced to manageable levels. Standardised test scores had been boosted just enough to qualify for better colleges and opportunities. I began to suspect that Y2K hadn't been a potential disaster at all. It had been a deliberate reset, a chance for some unknown force to edit reality itself and eliminate the sources of human suffering that were leading us towards civilizational collapse. The blackout, those missing 7 minutes and 44 seconds, had been the upload time for a new version of the world. A version where the variables that led to disaster had been carefully adjusted to produce better outcomes. But if that was true, what had been wrong with the original version that required such drastic intervention? And who or what had the power to change reality on such a fundamental level? More importantly, what happened to the people who remembered how things used to be? My obsession with finding evidence of the pre-reset world consumed the next decade of my life. I became a digital archaeologist, hunting through abandoned servers and forgotten backup tapes for what I started calling ghost fragments, pieces of code and data that remembered the world as it used to be, before the Great Edit had optimized everything for stability and reduced suffering. The hunt took me to the darkest corners of the internet, places where old systems went to die, and digital memories lingered long after their original purposes had been forgotten. I learned to navigate defunct corporate servers still humming in abandoned office buildings, powered by automated systems that continued their work years after the companies that created them had gone bankrupt or been absorbed by larger entities. University mainframes that had been forgotten during budget cuts became my specialty. Academic institutions were notoriously bad at decommissioning old equipment, often simply unplugging systems and leaving them in basement storage rooms where they continued to run on emergency power. These forgotten machines contained vast archives of research data, student records, and communication logs that hadn't been updated since the reset. Military installations were more challenging, but often more rewarding. Bases where the original programmers had retired or died without passing on access codes contained the most pristine examples of pre-reset data. The military's obsession with redundancy meant that critical information was often stored in multiple formats across different systems, and while the primary databases had been updated, backup systems sometimes retained the original versions. In these digital graveyards, I found fragments of the original timeline that painted a picture of a world that had been on the verge of collapse. Medical databases contained patient records for people who no longer existed, not dead, but simply absent from current reality. I found appointment schedules for doctors who had never been born, insurance claims for treatments that were no longer possible because the diseases they treated had been retroactively cured or prevented. Pharmaceutical research databases showed development timelines for drugs that had never been created, designed to treat conditions that no longer occurred with sufficient frequency to justify the investment. The most haunting discoveries were in paediatric hospitals. I found records of children with genetic conditions that had somehow been eliminated from their family lines, medical charts that showed progressive diseases that had been stopped mid-progression, treatment plans for young patients who had apparently been cured retroactively by changes to their genetic history. The cost of these miracles was that the parents of these children often had no memory of the medical struggles they had endured. Living in a reality where their families had always been healthy and whole, corporate archives held employment records for companies that had never existed, not failed businesses, but enterprises that had been prevented from forming in the first place. I found project files for products that had never been developed, because the social problems they were designed to solve had been eliminated at the source. Email chains discussed market research for demographic groups that no longer existed, management strategies for dealing with economic conditions that had been prevented. Movie studios had casting notes for films that weren't in any current filmography, scripts that dealt with social issues that were no longer relevant because the underlying problems had been edited out of history. Publishers had manuscript submissions for books that had never been written, novels that explored themes of desperation and survival that were no longer relatable to audiences living in the optimized reality. Television networks had development documents for news programs that covered wars that had never happened, environmental disasters that had been prevented, political scandals involving leaders who had never risen to power. The archives revealed an entire parallel entertainment industry that had been designing content for a much darker timeline, one where human suffering provided endless material for drama and documentary. But the most disturbing discoveries were personal. In the vast digital archives of social media platforms that were just beginning to emerge in the early 2000s, I found profiles and posts from people I remembered knowing, friends, classmates, even family members, who now insisted they had never met me. Their accounts showed a history of interactions with someone whose name had been scrubbed from the servers, leaving only empty spaces where conversations should have been. I found photo albums with gaps where pictures of certain people should have been. Not deleted images, but spaces that had never contained photos at all, as if the absent individuals had never existed to be photographed. Status updates referenced experiences and events that involved people who were no longer part of reality, creating nonsensical posts about shared activities with friends who had never been born. Dating websites contained profiles that referenced relationship histories with partners who couldn't be found in any database. Professional networking sites showed career connections to colleagues whose employment records showed no overlap with the people who claimed to know them. Even genealogy websites had been altered, showing family trees that had been pruned to remove branches that led to problematic outcomes. I began documenting these anomalies obsessively, building a comprehensive database of inconsistencies between the current world and the fragments I could recover. The pattern that emerged was both incredible and terrifying. Reality had been edited with surgical precision, removing elements that threatened stability while preserving everything else as much as possible. Natural disasters that should have killed millions had been prevented or minimized through small changes to weather patterns, geological structures and emergency response systems. Political leaders who would have started wars had never risen to power, often because the social conditions that would have supported them had been eliminated decades earlier. Economic collapses that would have destroyed entire nations had been averted through subtle changes to market conditions, regulatory frameworks, and international trade agreements. Even individual tragedies had been undone, fatal accidents prevented through minor changes to traffic patterns and road construction, terminal illnesses cured through genetic modifications that traced back generations, personal failures transformed into successes through small adjustments to educational opportunities and social connections. It was as if some benevolent force had identified every potential source of human suffering and systematically eliminated it from the timeline, working backward through cause and effect chains to find the minimal changes needed to produce optimal outcomes. But there was a cost that became more apparent as my investigation deepened. The people who had been removed from reality to prevent these disasters hadn't simply died. They had never existed. Their contributions to human knowledge, art, and culture had vanished with them. Scientific breakthroughs that would have saved different lives were never made because the researchers who would have made them were edited out of the timeline. Works of art that would have inspired generations were never created because the artists who would have produced them were prevented from being born. Love stories that would have produced children were never begun, eliminating entire family lines to prevent genetic diseases or psychological problems that would have manifested generations later. Teachers who would have inspired students to greatness were removed from the timeline, along with the innovations and discoveries that would have resulted from their influence. Even criminals and villains had been systematically prevented from existing, taking with them the heroes who would have risen to oppose them and the social progress that often emerged from confronting evil. The world had been optimized for stability and reduced suffering, but in the process it had lost something essential: the chaotic, unpredictable, beautiful mess of authentic human existence. The rough edges had been smoothed away, the sharp contrasts had been softened, and the result was a reality that was undeniably better in measurable ways, but somehow less real, less vivid, less alive. And I was beginning to realise that my investigation itself might be a threat to this carefully constructed paradise. The ghost fragments I'd been collecting were disappearing at an accelerating rate. Files I'd successfully downloaded and archived would corrupt themselves overnight, displaying nothing but random characters when I tried to access them again. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures, wiping themselves clean at the moment I tried to copy critical data. Even screenshots I'd taken of important discoveries would become unreadable, as if the very act of documenting the evidence triggered some kind of defensive response. More disturbing still, the people I tried to share my discoveries with would forget our conversations within days, sometimes within hours. Friends who had initially shown interest in my research would later deny that we'd ever discussed it, looking at me with genuine confusion when I mentioned their previous enthusiasm. Family members who had helped me search for anomalies would look at me with concern when I referenced their assistance, insisting that they had never been involved in any such investigation. It was as if the system was actively defending itself, using the same reality editing capabilities that had created the reset to eliminate threats to its stability. And with each fragment I uncovered, each inconsistency I documented, I was marking myself as a more significant threat that required more comprehensive countermeasures. The breadcrumbs I'd been leaving online, forum posts describing my findings, encrypted files stored on anonymous servers, even simple emails outlining my theories, were vanishing faster than I could create them. Entire websites I'd used to store backups would disappear overnight, their domains returning site not found errors as if they had never existed. Social media posts would be deleted not just from my accounts, but from the accounts of anyone who had shared or commented on them. I realised I was fighting a war against reality itself and I was losing. But I also realised that the very fact that I could perceive this war meant that I had somehow survived the reset with my memories intact, making me one of the few people who could serve as witness to what had really happened. Whether that was an accident or part of some larger plan, I couldn't determine, but I knew that my time was running out. The system was learning to counter my efforts more effectively with each attempt I made to preserve evidence. Soon, it would move beyond simply erasing my discoveries and begin erasing me. By 2010, 11 years after the reset, I had developed a comprehensive theory about what had really happened on New Year's Eve 1999 and who had been responsible for the greatest editing of reality in human history. With 2K hadn't been a bug, it had been a fail-safe mechanism, a last resort activation code built into the global digital infrastructure by entities I could only call the architects. The evidence I had accumulated suggested that humanity had reached a critical error state by the end of 1999, a convergence of cascading failures that would have led to the complete collapse of human civilization within a decade. The global economy was on the verge of a meltdown that would have made the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Environmental degradation was accelerating beyond any recoverable limits, with multiple ecosystem collapses triggering feedback loops that would have rendered the planet uninhabitable. Most critically, our increasing dependence on fragile technological systems had created cascading failure points that could have ended modern civilization with a single catastrophic malfunction. Political tensions were building toward conflicts that would have made World War III inevitable. Nuclear proliferation had reached a point where multiple non-state actors had access to weapons of mass destruction. Social inequalities had grown to levels that historically preceded revolutions and societal collapse. Disease outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more resistant to treatment, suggesting that a global pandemic capable of ending human civilization was imminent. The architects, whether they were human agencies operating in complete secrecy, artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness decades earlier than anyone suspected, or something else entirely, had been monitoring these failure conditions through the global digital infrastructure that was becoming increasingly integrated into every aspect of human activity. They had run the projections, calculated the probabilities, and reached the same conclusion that my own research had suggested. Without intervention, human civilization would end before 2010. When the convergent crises reached a mathematical certainty of complete collapse, they activated the reset protocol. The 7 minutes and 44 seconds of blackout hadn't been a system failure. It had been an upload period, a moment when the architects implemented a new version of reality where the critical errors had been corrected through targeted modifications to the timeline. The duration was significant, long enough to implement comprehensive changes across multiple systems and data archives, but short enough to avoid creating obvious gaps in human memory that would have made the edit detectable to most observers. This theory explained many of the anomalies I had discovered, including the accelerated technological development of the 21st century. Smartphones, social media platforms, advanced internet infrastructure, GPS systems, medical imaging technology, innovations that should have taken decades to develop, were suddenly available within a few years of the reset. It was as if the architects had compressed technological advancement, giving humanity tools to manage the complexities of modern civilization more effectively and prevent the conditions that had led to the original timeline's collapse. The compression wasn't just technological but temporal. Events that should have unfolded gradually over decades were happening in compressed timeframes, as if history itself was running at an accelerated pace to reach stable endpoints more quickly. Cultural changes that should have taken generations occurred within years. Political movements that should have required decades to mature reached full development within electoral cycles. Even individual human development seemed accelerated, with people reaching emotional and intellectual milestones faster than historical norms suggested they should. But the compression had side effects that became more apparent as I studied the patterns of change. Time itself felt different after 2000, more fluid, less substantial, less anchored to physical reality. Events seemed to unfold with unnatural speed, following narrative structures that were too clean, too purposeful, too optimized for dramatic effect. The pace of innovation was almost impossibly rapid, with breakthrough discoveries happening at a rate that suggested they were being introduced according to a predetermined schedule, rather than emerging from natural scientific inquiry. The 21st century felt less like natural historical progression, and more like a carefully scripted sequence of events designed to guide humanity toward specific outcomes. Wars ended more quickly and cleanly than historical patterns suggested they should. Economic crises were resolved through mechanisms that appeared almost overnight. Social problems were addressed by solutions that seemed to materialize just when they were needed most. I began to suspect that the 21st century wasn't happening in real time at all, but was instead a carefully coded simulation running at accelerated speed to bring humanity to a stable endpoint as quickly as possible. The déjà vu experiences that became increasingly common after Y2K weren't just psychological phenomena, they were processing errors, moments when the simulation briefly revealed its underlying structure to conscious observers. The Mandela effect, which wouldn't be widely recognised and named until years later, was actually evidence of ongoing system maintenance. When large numbers of people remembered events differently than the official record showed, it wasn't false memory. It was remnants of previous versions of the timeline bleeding through the code. The system was constantly making minor adjustments to optimize outcomes. and these adjustments sometimes left traces in human memory that didn't match the updated official version of events. But understanding the system and fighting it were two different challenges entirely. The more I learned about the architect's modifications, the more I realised how comprehensive and sophisticated their control had become. They hadn't just edited history, they had created a self-maintaining reality that could automatically detect and correct for new threats to stability. Every time I made a significant discovery, every time I found evidence that could expose the true nature of our reality, the system would respond with countermeasures, not dramatically, not in ways that would create obvious paradoxes or logical inconsistencies, but subtly, carefully, rewriting the context around my discoveries until they appeared meaningless, delusional, or simply mistaken. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly contradicting evidence of the reset, the system would alter the circumstances surrounding that evidence. Witnesses would develop memory problems or psychological conditions that made their testimony unreliable. Documents would be discovered to have been created by known hoaxers or discredited researchers. Physical evidence would be revealed to have mundane explanations that made conspiracy theories seem ridiculous. I was beginning to understand that my investigation itself might have been anticipated, even planned for by the architects. Perhaps they needed someone to remember the original timeline, to serve as a reference point for their ongoing modifications. Perhaps my resistance was actually serving their purposes in ways I couldn't comprehend, providing feedback that helped them refine their reality editing algorithms. Or perhaps I was simply a bug in their code, a corrupted file that had somehow survived the reset but was slowly being debugged out of existence through increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The evidence suggested that the architects were not merely powerful, but were operating on a level of technological sophistication that bordered on godlike. They could edit reality retroactively, alter human memory, and manipulate physical matter at the quantum level. They could predict the long-term consequences of small changes across vast networks of cause and effect. They could coordinate modifications across multiple timelines simultaneously. But they were not omniscient or omnipotent. The fact that my memories had survived the reset, that ghost fragments of the original timeline could still be found in forgotten databases, suggested that their control had limits. They could edit reality, but they couldn't completely rewrite it without creating inconsistencies that might expose their intervention. They needed reality to appear natural, authentic, believable. They needed people to accept the edited version of the world as the only version that had ever existed, and that requirement created vulnerabilities that a determined investigator could exploit. The question was whether I could exploit those vulnerabilities before the system completed its debugging process and eliminated me entirely. The breakthrough came in 2015, 16 years after the reset, when I finally cracked the encryption on a series of files I'd recovered from a decommissioned military satellite. The satellite had been part of an early warning system for nuclear attacks, launched in the 1970s and officially decommissioned in 1998. But like many military systems, it had never actually been turned off. It continued to orbit Earth, collecting and storing data according to its original programming, invisible to modern tracking systems that didn't know to look for it. The data contained what appeared to be source code, not for any software I recognised, but for something far more fundamental. It was code for reality itself. The files were massive, containing algorithms that described not just physical laws and mathematical constants, but human behaviour, historical patterns, and what could only be described as narrative structure. It was as if the universe itself was running on a sophisticated program, one that could be modified and updated like any other software system, with reality serving as both the operating system and the user interface. The code was written in a language that combined elements from every programming paradigm I had ever encountered, with additional constructs that seemed to operate according to principles I couldn't fully comprehend. Variables represented abstract concepts like historical momentum, causal density, and narrative coherence. Functions manipulated not just data, but the fundamental relationships between events, people, and outcomes. Within this code, I found references to error correction protocols and stability maintenance subroutines that operated continuously in the background of reality, monitoring for conditions that could lead to timeline instability. There were variables for historical consistency, causal coherence, and something called observer compliance, the system's ability to ensure that conscious beings accepted the reality they were experiencing as authentic and natural. Most chilling of all, I found a directory labelled Deprecated Entities, a vast database of people, places and events that had been removed from the active timeline. The database was searchable, and I spent weeks combing through it, finding friends, family members, even entire historical events that had been edited out of existence. Each entry contained not just the basic information about what had been removed, but detailed analysis of the causal chains that had made removal necessary. I found records of my childhood friend Marcus, who had died in a car accident when we were 15. According to the database, Marcus hadn't been removed because of his death, but because he would have survived the accident and gone on to become a brilliant engineer who developed a revolutionary new battery technology. The problem was that his invention would have been misused by a terrorist organisation to create portable nuclear devices, leading to attacks that would have killed millions. Rather than prevent the specific misuse, the system had chosen to prevent Marcus from existing at all, along with his potential contributions to both beneficial and harmful technologies. My high school girlfriend Sarah was listed as deprecated because she would have become an investigative journalist who exposed government corruption related to environmental cover-ups. Her reporting would have triggered a political crisis that led to the collapse of several democratic governments and their replacement by authoritarian regimes. The cost of saving the environment through her work would have been the loss of human freedom across multiple continents. Even more disturbing were the entries for people I had never known existed. Family members who had been edited out of my bloodline before I was born, potential siblings who had been prevented from being conceived, grandparents whose life stories had been altered to prevent them from passing on genetic predispositions or psychological traits that would have made their descendants less stable or happy. The database contained millions of such entries, each representing a person whose existence had been deemed too costly to the overall stability of the timeline. But it also contained entries for positive elements that had been enhanced or created. People who had been made more attractive, more intelligent, more emotionally stable than they would have been naturally. Historical figures whose accomplishments had been amplified through subtle changes to their circumstances and capabilities. But my greatest mistake was assuming that my access to these files was accidental. As I dug deeper into the code, I began to notice references to something called the Observer Protocol. This appeared to be a special subroutine designed to handle individuals who became aware of the system's existence, people who developed the ability to perceive the artificial nature of their reality, despite the programming designed to prevent such awareness. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of immediately deleting aware individuals from the timeline, which could create obvious gaps that might make other observers suspicious, the system would gradually edit their credibility, their relationships, and finally their existence itself over an extended period. The process was designed to look natural. The affected individual would appear to descend into paranoid delusion, gradually alienating friends and family with increasingly bizarre theories about reality manipulation. Their evidence would be systematically discredited or destroyed. Their support networks would be eroded through subtle manipulation of social dynamics, and their mental health would be undermined through targeted psychological pressure. Eventually, they would become so isolated and discredited that their complete disappearance would seem like a logical conclusion to their mental deterioration. Friends and family would remember them as troubled individuals who had lost touch with reality, making their absence feel like a relief rather than a tragedy. The few people who might have supported their theories would be dealt with through similar but less intensive applications of the protocol. I realised with growing horror that I had been following this script perfectly for the past 16 years. My obsession with the reset, my alienation from friends and family, my increasingly desperate attempts to document evidence that kept disappearing, it was all part of the Observer Protocol's execution. Every move I had made, every discovery I had celebrated, every moment of apparent progress in my investigation had been anticipated and accounted for in the system's response algorithms. but knowing about the protocol didn't free me from it. If anything, awareness of the process seemed to accelerate its implementation. The reality edits became more frequent and more dramatic. People who had known me for decades began to deny that we'd ever met. Not just forgetting our conversations about the reset, but forgetting me entirely. Photographs of me started disappearing from family albums, leaving empty spaces where I should have been. Even official records, my birth certificate, school transcripts, tax returns, employment history, began showing inconsistencies that gradually erased my legal existence. Social security numbers that returned no matches in government databases. Bank accounts that were frozen not for any legal reason, but because the institutions had no record of my identity. Credit reports that showed financial activity for someone who apparently didn't exist. I tried to fight back by creating multiple backups of my research, storing files across dozens of different servers and platforms, using encryption techniques that should have been unbreakable. But the system was faster and more thorough than I could ever be. Data would corrupt itself the moment I tried to access it, displaying only random characters or error messages. Email accounts would be mysteriously closed for terms of service violations that were never specified. Even handwritten notes would fade as if the ink itself was defective, leaving only blank pages where crucial information had been recorded. More sophisticated attempts to preserve evidence failed in ways that seemed to mock my efforts. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures that destroyed their contents without damaging the devices themselves. Cloud storage services would report that my files had never been uploaded, despite confirmation emails proving that they had been successfully stored. Even physical photographs would fade or become mysteriously damaged, as if the reality editing could extend to manipulating matter itself. In desperation, I began leaving digital breadcrumbs in online forums, encrypted messages hidden in image files, and coded warnings embedded in seemingly innocent comments on social media. But even these were being systematically hunted down and eliminated by algorithms that seemed capable of detecting subversive content, regardless of how cleverly it was disguised. The system's response became increasingly aggressive as my activities escalated. Not only were my own efforts being countered, but anyone who showed interest in my theories began experiencing similar effects. Forum posts asking questions about Y2K anomalies would be deleted by moderators who claimed they violated community guidelines. Users who tried to download my encrypted files would find that their internet connections mysteriously failed during the transfer. Even casual conversations about strange memories from around the year 2000 would be interrupted by distractions or forgotten entirely. I realised that the Observer Protocol was not just targeting me, but was creating a quarantine zone around anyone who came into contact with reality-threatening information. The system was protecting itself by ensuring that dangerous knowledge could not spread beyond the original infected individual. But the most disturbing revelation came when I found my own entry in the deprecated entities database. According to the file, I had been scheduled for removal from the timeline years earlier, but my deletion had been postponed indefinitely due to my classification as a useful aberration. The system was keeping me alive not because it couldn't eliminate me, but because my investigation was serving some purpose in its larger operational framework. I had become a controlled opposition, a safety valve that allowed the system to monitor and contain potential threats to its stability. My research was being permitted to continue because it helped the architects identify weaknesses in their reality editing algorithms. Every method I discovered for detecting anomalies was being studied and countered, making their future interventions more seamless and undetectable. My entire investigation, my years of searching for truth, my desperate attempts to warn others about the nature of our reality, it had all been part of an elaborate debugging process. I was an unwitting beta tester for reality manipulation technology, helping to refine the very system I was trying to expose. The system was closing in, and I was running out of time. But knowing that my elimination was inevitable gave me a strange kind of freedom. If I was going to be deleted from reality, I might as well make my final actions count for something. I began planning one last desperate attempt to break through the system's defences and leave behind evidence that could survive my erasure. The final phase began on December 31st, 2015, exactly 16 years after the original reset. I had been documenting my research obsessively, aware that each day might be my last, when the reality edits suddenly accelerated beyond anything I had experienced before. The system had apparently decided that my usefulness as a debugging tool had been exhausted, and it was time to implement the final stage of the Observer Protocol. I woke up that morning to find that my name had been removed from the lease agreement on my apartment. The landlord, someone I'd been paying rent to for 3 years, looked at me with genuine confusion when I tried to explain the situation. According to his records, the apartment had been vacant for months, and he had no memory of ever meeting me. When I showed him bank statements proving my rent payments, he stared at them as if they were forgeries, unable to reconcile the financial records with his complete lack of memory regarding our landlord-tenant relationship. My bank accounts were frozen, not for any legal reason that the institutions could explain, but because the banks had no record of my existence. My social security number returned no matches in government databases. Credit reporting agencies had no files associated with my identity. Even utility companies claimed that my address had never had service in my name, despite years of bills and payment confirmations that I could produce as evidence. The erasure was happening in real time, with records being modified even as I tried to access them. I would log into an account, confirm that my information was present and correct, then refresh the page to find that all references to my identity had vanished. Customer service representatives would start conversations acknowledging my account, then become confused mid-sentence as the data disappeared from their screens while we were talking. But the most devastating change was with my family. When I went to my mother's house, desperately seeking some anchor to reality, she answered the door as if I were a stranger. Not the careful politeness of someone who had forgotten an acquaintance, but the genuine bewilderment of someone confronted by a complete stranger who claimed intimate knowledge of their life. Her face showed no recognition, no spark of familiarity, no indication that she had ever seen me before in her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with concern for my apparent mental state, "but I think you have me confused with someone else. I never had any children." I showed her photographs of us together, pointed to family mementos that I'd given her over the years, recounted shared memories from my childhood with perfect accuracy. But she looked at the photos and saw empty spaces where I should have been, as if the images had been edited to remove my presence while leaving subtle shadows and positioning that proved someone had been there. The gifts I had given her had different origin stories, presents from friends whose names she couldn't quite remember, items she had bought herself during shopping trips that she recalled with unusual vagueness. When I described specific events from our shared history, family vacations, birthday celebrations, conversations we'd had just weeks earlier, she listened with the patient concern of someone dealing with a delusional stranger. The events I described had happened, but in her memory, they had involved other people or had occurred differently. Family gatherings had taken place without me. Holidays had been celebrated in my absence. Important family milestones had been reached without my participation. The reality editing had reached the point where my existence was being retroactively removed from the timeline. I wasn't just being forgotten. I was being systematically deleted from history itself, with the changes propagating backward through time to create a consistent narrative in which I had never been born. In panic, I tried to contact others who might remember me. Friends from school, former co-workers, even casual acquaintances from online communities. But I found that my phone no longer worked. Not broken or damaged, simply unable to connect to any network, as if my device was no longer authorized to exist on the communication grid. The phone would show full signal strength, but would fail to complete any calls, with error messages claiming that the numbers I was trying to reach did not exist. Internet access became equally problematic. My computer could connect to networks, but websites would fail to load properly, displaying broken layouts and missing content, as if my presence was corrupting the data transfer. Social media platforms would refuse to load my profiles, or would display error messages claiming that my accounts had been suspended for terms of service violations that were never specified. I rushed back to my apartment, hoping to salvage what remained of my research, but found that the building's security system no longer recognised my keycards or even my biometric data. The electronic locks that had opened for me thousands of times now acted as if I was a complete stranger, attempting unauthorised entry. The guards didn't throw me out. They simply couldn't see me, their eyes sliding past me as if I were invisible, unable to focus on my presence even when I stood directly in front of them. This was the most disturbing aspect of the erasure process. I wasn't just being removed from records and memories, I was being edited out of other people's perception. I was becoming a ghost, visible only to myself, unable to interact with a world that was forgetting I had ever existed. The few people who could still see me treated me as if I was a hallucination or a figment of their imagination. A homeless man I tried to talk to looked through me as if I wasn't there, then suddenly jerked his head around as if he had heard a voice but couldn't locate its source. A child playing in a park briefly made eye contact with me, then ran to her mother claiming that she had seen the invisible man, only to be told that she was letting her imagination run wild. Even security cameras seemed unable to record my presence. I could see myself in mirrors and reflective surfaces, but surveillance footage would show empty spaces where I should have been, creating the impossible impression that I was a vampire or some other supernatural entity that couldn't be captured on film. In desperation, I broke into an internet cafe, using an old-fashioned computer that might not be connected to the systems that were hunting me. The machine was ancient by 2015 standards, running software that predated many of the modern network protocols that seemed to be blocking my access. I had perhaps minutes before the reality edits caught up with this location, before my presence here was also erased from possibility. My hands shook as I typed what I knew would be my final message, my last chance to warn someone about what was happening. But even as I typed, I could feel my thoughts becoming fuzzy, my memories becoming uncertain. The system wasn't just erasing my existence, it was editing my consciousness itself, making me forget who I had been and what I had discovered. The words on the screen began to blur, not physically but conceptually, as if their meaning was becoming uncertain. I could see the letters, but their significance was slipping away from me like water through my fingers. The knowledge I'd spent 16 years accumulating was being systematically deleted from my mind, leaving only confusion and growing amnesia. I fought to maintain focus, to hold on to the core message long enough to complete it. The world had ended in 1999. Everything since then had been a backup simulation. The system was watching, always watching, and when it detected threats to its stability, it would implement the Observer Protocol. People who remembered too much would be gradually erased, first from records, then from memory, finally from existence itself. But even as I typed these warnings, I could feel them becoming meaningless. The concepts that had driven my investigation for 16 years were dissolving, leaving only the vague impression that something was wrong with the world, something that I could no longer articulate or even fully remember. The screen flickered. My vision became uncertain. I could no longer remember why I was sitting at this computer or what I had been trying to type. The words on the screen looked like random characters, devoid of meaning or context. Somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of fireworks, or maybe it was just memory, the echo of a celebration from a lifetime ago, when the world had ended and been replaced with something better, safer, more stable. But somewhere in the deepest part of my fading consciousness, I held on to one last thought. If someone reads this, if these words somehow survive the erasure, then maybe the truth can still,